The narrow shop on Fulton Street sat between a chandler's storefront and a tailor's window, its door a simple panel of oak with a brass knob worn to a dull sheen. Morning had passed, and the early afternoon light fell slantwise through the high, dusty window at the back, casting a long rectangle of pale gold upon the floorboards and climbing partway up the workbench. Inside, the air rested still and cool, carrying the scent of camphor, cedar shavings, and the faint mineral bite of arsenical soap. The taxidermist stood near the bench, his hands at rest on a folded length of muslin, watching the motes of dust turn in the shaft of light as though they were performing a slow, silent dance for no one. The door opened without hurry, letting in a breath of street air that stirred the motes and then settled. A gentleman stepped inside, and with him came the distant sounds of wagon wheels and the low murmur of foot traffic before the door eased shut and sealed the workshop back into its quiet. He was tall, with a thin face and greying hair combed smoothly back, and he wore a dark wool coat with a velvet collar, his beaver hat in his hands. He carried a willow basket, not large, its handle looped over one arm, and he set it down upon the counter with the careful motion of a man handling something delicate. The basket was made of pale willow withes woven into a tight pattern, the lid fastened with a small leather strap and a bone button, and inside, a thick lining of raw cotton wadding filled every hollow, cradling a shape that was still and silent. The taxidermist turned from the window and approached the counter, his steps unhurried on the worn floorboards. He nodded to the gentleman and received a quiet greeting in return, the words spoken softly, almost as if they were inside a library. The gentleman loosened the strap and lifted the lid from the basket, peeling back the top layer of cotton with the tips of his fingers. Within the nest of fibers lay a single passenger pigeon, a male, its body whole and fresh, the feathers smooth and undisturbed. The taxidermist leaned a little closer, adjusting his spectacles, while the light from the high window struck across the basket and brought a shimmer to the bird's plumage. The taxidermist's own hands, calm and sure, lifted the pigeon with a touch that distributed the weight evenly, the body resting across both palms. He turned the bird slowly beneath the light, noting the tiny serrations on the leading edge of the primary feathers, the way the underwing coverts shaded from soft grey to a pale buff. The throat feathers shimmered with an iridescence that shifted as he moved it, catching the colours of oil on dark water, a gleam of purple, a wash of deep green, then a momentary flash of bronze. The crown and nape were a soft slate blue, fading into the grey-brown of the back and the folded wings, while the breast glowed with a delicate pinkish cinnamon that paled toward the belly, where the feathers turned almost white. The feet, though small, were sturdy, with sharp claws that had grasped countless branches, and the scales on the tarsus overlapped like minute roof tiles. A speck of dried mud clung to one toe, and he removed it with the tip of his little fingernail, letting the fragment fall into the basket. The taxidermist let his gaze travel over the bird's entire form, from the long pointed tail feathers to the short black bill and the deep red-orange of the feet, now curled and still. He noted the unbroken primaries, the clean edges of the wing coverts, the way the feathers lay in smooth tracks, as if the bird had only just settled to roost. A faint scent of dry leaves and distant woodlands clung to the plumage, mingling with the indoor smells of camphor and old wood. The gentleman waited without speaking, his hands resting on the counter, his posture patient, as if he understood that such an examination required its own measure of time. After a long moment, the taxidermist set the bird down upon a clean pine board that lay at the side of the workbench, arranging it on its back with the wings tucked close and the tail feathers extended straight. He looked at the gentleman and asked in a low voice what manner of pose he desired and how the mount was to be displayed. The gentleman's reply came softly, each word placed as carefully as a coin onto a desk. "A simple resting pose," he said. The bird should sit upon a natural branch, as though it had just alighted there, perhaps turning its head a little to one side, inspecting something hidden among leaves or lichen. Nothing dramatic, nothing showy, just the quiet stillness of a wild bird at ease. The taxidermist nodded, and his mind began to shake the mount even as his hands lay still. He asked if the gentleman had a particular wood in mind, a type of perch, or if he preferred the taxidermist to choose something suitable. The gentleman replied that he trusted the craftsman's eye, and then they spoke of the price, A modest sum in silver coin covering the skinning, the making of the body form, the wiring, the glass eyes, the branch, and the final mounting upon a polished base. The gentleman produced a small leather purse and counted out a portion of the sum as a deposit, which the taxidermist accepted and placed in a drawer beneath the counter. When the transaction was settled, the gentleman reached into an inner pocket of his coat and produced a visiting card, a small rectangle of cream-colored paper with engraved lettering. He placed it on the counter beside the basket, and the taxidermist read the name, Mr. Misters, Reginald Ashby, and beneath it a street address on the quieter northern side of the city, a neighborhood of wide townhouses and elm-lined walks. The cardstock felt cool and smooth, its edges crisp from the engraver's press. The name was printed in a fine serif type, and beneath it the street and number was centered with careful spacing. The taxidermist imagined the townhouse at that address, its windows catching the morning light, the cabinet room where this bird would eventually rest, a quiet monument amid other curiosities. He slipped the card into a wooden case that held a dozen such tokens from past commissions, a merchant's widow who wanted a canary preserved, a sea captain who had brought back a tropic bird from his travels, a young scholar with a collection of beetles. Each card held a promise of work completed, and the case now held one more. The gentleman then took his leave, lifting his hat in a small gesture, and the door opened and closed again, admitting a brief wash of city noise before the silence returned. The taxidermist stood still for a moment, his gaze resting on the closed door. Then he turned back to the workbench where the pigeon lay. Before covering the bird, he brushed a stray fiber of cotton from its breast with the back of a fingernail, a touch so light the feathers barely moved. Then he lifted the square of muslin, shook it once to free any loose particles, and let it settle over the pigeon like a gentle fall of snow, opaque and protective. He tucked the edges under the pine board so that the fabric formed a soft tent that kept away dust and drafts. The shape of the pigeon beneath the cloth was a gentle mound, barely rising above the wood, and in the dimness of the shop it could have been a stone or a folded piece of fabric. The taxidermist smoothed the muslin with his palm, a slow motion, and then he went to the basin in the corner and washed his hands carefully with a lump of brown soap, rinsing them and drying them on a linen cloth that hung from a peg. The light in the shop had begun its afternoon decline, the rectangle on the floor shifting and stretching toward the wall. As the afternoon deepened, the quality of light changed as well, its gold softening into a honeyed amber that stained the pine board a richer brown. The shadow of the window frame cast across the floor lengthened slowly, its edges blurring slightly as the dust motes continued their aimless drifting, fewer now, as if even the dust was settling for the day. The taxidermist watched the line of shadow touch the leg of the workbench and begin its crawl upward, and he felt the temperature in the room drop by a degree, the shop exhaling the last of the sun's warmth. The noises of the street outside softened into the general hum of the city at ease. He went to the window and looked out through the dusty glass at the narrow street below, where a cart passed with a load of barrels, and a woman in a grey shawl walked slowly toward the corner. The sky above the rooftops was a pale wash of blue, cloudless and calm. He returned to the bench and lifted one corner of the muslin to look again at the passenger pigeon, as if to confirm that nothing had altered in the last few minutes. The bird lay as it had before, still and cool, its colors muted by the fabric shadow. He let the cloth fall back and then busied himself with a small task at the side of the shop, sorting a row of glass eyes that sat in a shallow tray lined with felt. He picked up each eye, turned it between thumb and forefinger, and placed it back in its depression, pair by pair, sizes ranging from tiny wren to larger crow. The brown eyes that he would later set into the pigeon's head were not among this tray. He kept those in a separate box, and he made a mental note to check the stock in the morning. The afternoon wore on without haste, the shop settling into its own slow rhythm. The taxidermist opened a drawer and took out a small ledger bound in marbled paper, in which he recorded each commission with a date and a brief description. Using a worn quill and a pot of iron gall ink, he wrote the day's entry in a neat sloping hand, the gentleman's name, the species, the deposit received, the promised completion a fortnight from now. The inkwell gave a faint reflection of the lamp flame as he replaced the stopper, a tiny dot of light swimming on the dark liquid. The quill he wiped on a scrap of blotting paper and set back in its holder. Then he dusted a bit of pounce powder over the fresh writing to fix it, tapping away the excess. The ink dried to a soft black on the pale page, and he closed the book and returned it to the drawer. Outside, the light began to mellow toward the gold of late afternoon, and the taxidermist lit a single oil lamp, its flame steady behind the glass chimney. The lamp pushed a small circle of warm light onto the bench, leaving the corners of the shop in deeper shadow, and the muslin-covered bird sat at the edge of that glow, a quiet shape awaiting tomorrow. The taxidermist sat down on the high stool near the bench and rested his hands on his knees, his back straight, his breathing even. He looked at the covered bird for a long while, not thinking of anything in particular, just resting his eyes on the shape and the folds of the cloth. The sounds from the streets had faded now, replaced by an occasional distant call, the closing of a neighbor's shutter, the soft thump of a horse's hoof on packed earth. A watchman's call, distant and faint, marked the hour, the notes drifting through the still air like leaves on a pond. The shop held the silence like a cupped hand, and within that silence the motes still drifted, slower now, as if the day itself were growing drowsy. The taxidermist's thoughts drifted too, touching on the work that lay ahead, the skinning, the careful scraping, the mixing of preservatives, the winding of toe into the shape of a body, the setting of the glass eyes. He had done such work many times, each bird a small world of its own, and yet each one demanded the same quiet focus, the same slow movement of hands. After a time, he rose and walked to the front door, sliding the bolt into place and drawing a curtain across the small pane of glass set into the upper panel. The shop was now sealed for the night, the only light coming from the oil lamp and the last trace of window glow above. He went to the workbench one final time, checked that the muslin was still tucked firmly around the pine board, and then he took up the lamp and carried it through a doorway at the rear of the shop into a narrow hall that led to his private quarters. The lamp flame bobbed gently, casting shifting shadows on the plaster walls, and then the doorway darkened and the shop was left to the silence, the dark and the sleeping passenger pigeon under its tent of cloth. The dawn arrived, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual thinning of the darkness, a slow change that began in the high window at the back of the shop and spread outward like water soaking into paper. At first the glass held only the faintest suggestion of grey, a colour so weak it could barely be distinguished from the black of the night. But minute by minute, the grey strengthened, taking on a cooler tone that hinted of the coming of the sun. The room remained silent, except for the tiny creaks of the building's timbers adjusting to the temperature, the soft settling of the floorboards, and somewhere far away, the first thin call of a morning bird. The muslin-covered shape on the workbench stayed motionless, a pale mound in the middle of the dim space, waiting for the hands that would soon resume their work. The taxidermist rose from his bed in the narrow room behind the shop, washed his face and hands in a basin of cold water, and dressed in the same plain wool trousers, linen shirt and cloth apron he wore every day. The apron was stained with the faint traces of many previous commissions, a spot of dark oil near the hem, a smudge of powdered alum worked into the weave, a line of faint rust from an old wire. He tied the apron strings behind his back with the familiarity of long habit. Then he stepped through the doorway into the workshop, carrying a small tin box of lucifer matches. The air inside the shop was cooler than the air in his quarters, and it carried the same layered scent it had held the day before, though now with an added note of cold dust and the faint memory of lamp oil from the night. He went first to the window and stood for a moment looking out at the street, where the grey light was beginning to pick out the edges of roof lines and the tops of the few leafless trees that grew along the sidewalk. A thin mist hung low over the cobblestones, softening the outlines of the opposite buildings, and a single cart rolled by with a driver huddled in his coat, the horse's breath puffing white in the chill air. The taxidermist watched the cart pass out of sight and then turned back to the room, reaching up to pull the cord that opened the high vent near the ceiling, letting in a fresh ribbon of morning air that stirred the dust on the sill and made the lamp flame flicker once before settling. On the workbench, the spirit lamp still held a small amount of fuel from the night before. He struck a match, the tiny flare of sulphur and wood lighting his face briefly, and touched it to the wick. The flame rose a steady blue-tipped yellow, and he adjusted the small brass knob until the light burned clean and bright. The lamp cast its glow across the pine board where the covered bird waited, and the muslin took on a warm, almost golden tint where the light touched it. He set the lamp at the far corner of the bench, where it would illuminate the working area without shining directly into his eyes. Next he went to the stone sink in the corner and lifted the wooden lid from a copper cistern, dipping a pewter basin into the cool, clear water that had been drawn from the well the day before. He filled the basin halfway and set it on a folded cloth on the bench, the water's surface shimmering and still. Then he walked to a small shelf near the door and took down a leather strop, its surface dark with years of use and polished to a soft sheen by countless passes of steel. He hung the strop from a hook on the edge of the bench and reached for the wooden case that held his scalpel set, a slim box of polished beechwood with brass hinges that opened on well-worn grooves. From the case he removed 2 scalpels, their blades protected by thin sheaths of oiled paper. He slid the paper off and held each blade up to the lamplight, turning it slowly to catch any imperfection or dull spot. The steel was clean but had lost a fraction of its edge since the last sharpening. With the patience of a man to whom sharpness was not a luxury but a foundation, he set the first blade against the strop at a precise angle, a tilt so slight it was almost invisible, and drew it across the leather with a long, even stroke that made a soft, rhythmic whisper. He turned the blade and repeated the motion on the other side. The sound a steady shush, shush that filled the quiet room like the breathing of the shop itself. This continued without haste, stroke after stroke, the taxidermist's wrist moving with the ease of muscle memory, his eyes focused on the edge, checking the gleam at each pause. When the first scalpel could catch the light without reflecting a single spot of dullness, he set it aside on a clean cloth and began the same process with the second. The whisper of steel on leather was the only sound, a gentle lull that matched the slow brightening of the window above. When both scalpels lay sharp and ready, he put away the strop and turned to the shelf of supplies that lined one wall of the shop. The shelf was made of dark oak boards supported by iron brackets, and on it rested an orderly collection of jars, pots, boxes, and bundles, each labeled with small slips of paper in the taxidermist's own handwriting. He reached for a shallow glass dish and placed it on the bench, then opened a ceramic jar with a cork stopper and poured a mound of powdered alum into the dish, a fine white substance that looked like ground sugar and smelled faintly metallic and clean. The alum settled into a small hill, and he smoothed its surface with the back of a spoon until it formed an even layer. Beside the alum, he set a squat earthenware pot with a tight-fitting lid painted a deep brown, the label reading "Arsenical Soap" in careful script. He lifted the lid just long enough to check the consistency, a pale greyish-white paste that smelled sharply of camphor and something more mineral, and then he resealed it and set a small flat brush beside the pot for later use. The brush had short, stiff bristles, perfect for working the preservative into the inside of the skin without wasting any of the soap. From a drawer beneath the shelf he selected more tools, laying each one on the bench with the same deliberate placement. A pair of thin-nosed pliers with jaws that met precisely, their handles wrapped in faded leather. A set of wire snips with a spring mechanism that opened the blades when he relaxed his grip. A small bone spatula, its edge rounded and polished from use, for separating skin from tissue. Several curved needles of different sizes, thrust into a small cushion made of red flannel, each needle already threaded with fine black silk that looked almost invisible in the dim light. A spool of the same silk thread stood nearby and a chunk of beeswax for running the thread through, which he did now, drawing each strand across the wax with a quick, practiced motion that left the thread smooth and slightly tacky. A pair of brass forceps with locking handles, their tips serrated for a firm grip on delicate material. A glass bottle of cedar oil, its liquid the color of pale honey, stoppered with a ground glass plug. Finally he brought out the bundle of clean tow, a mass of light brown fibers that came from unraveled rope and looked something like coarse, tangled hair. The tow sat in a woven basket, smelling of dry plant matter and a hint of the sea salt that had once been in the rigging lines from which it had been picked. He fluffed a handful of the fibers, pulling them apart to check that they were free of knots and debris, then set the basket on the floor beside his stool, within easy reach. The preparation of materials had taken the better part of an hour, and now the workbench held everything the taxidermist would need for the first stage of the mounting. He paused and surveyed the arrangement, his eyes moving from left to right, the basin of water, the scalpels, the alum, the arsenical soap and brush, the pliers, the snips, the needles and thread, the forceps, the cedar oil, the towel, and at the center of it all, the still-covered passenger pigeon. The tools looked like the instruments of some quiet and patient profession, which they were, and the taxidermist felt the familiar calm that came when all was ready and there was nothing left to do but begin. He reached for the muslin and lifted it away, folding it into a neat square and setting it aside. The pigeon lay on the pine board exactly as he had left it. The head turned slightly to one side, the feet curled, the plumage smooth and unruffled. In the lamplight, the iridescent throat feathers shimmered more distinctly than they had the afternoon before, the purple and green and bronze shifting as he leaned closer. The pinkish breast seemed almost to hold a warmth of its own, though of course it was cold. The taxidermist looked at the bird for a long moment, not as a specimen but as the thing it had been, a living creature that had flown in vast flocks across the eastern forests, and then his expression softened and he lifted the bird with both hands and transferred it to a piece of thick corkboard that he laid flat on the bench. The corkboard was large enough to pin out the skin later, but for now it simply provided a soft, non-slip surface. He positioned the pigeon on its back, the wings tucked close to the body, and then he opened the drawer beneath the bench and withdrew a pair of brass calipers. The calipers had two slender curved arms connected by a knurled thumb wheel that adjusted the span with a smooth, precise motion, and the tips were capped with tiny ivory buttons to prevent them from puncturing anything delicate. The taxidermist wiped the tips on his apron and then began to measure. He first measured the total length of the bird from the tip of the bill to the end of the longest tail feather, pressing the calipers gently into position and reading the span against a small brass ruler that he held in his other hand. The number, something near 16 inches, he murmured once under his breath, a sound so soft it barely escaped his lips, and then he moved on to the girth of the breast, sliding the calipers around the widest part of the chest, taking care not to compress the feathers, reading the circumference with a slow, steady gaze. The figure settled into his mind like a pebble dropping into still water. He next measured the width of the skull, a delicate operation that required the calipers to span the head just behind the eyes, the ivory tips touching the feathers with minimal pressure, and the number, just over an inch, he added to the silent list he was building inside himself. He turned his attention to the wings, carefully extending the left wing and supporting it at the humerus with his left hand, the calipers finding the length of the bone beneath the skin, his fingers moving along the wing to locate the small knob of the joint. The humerus measurement was followed by the ulna, then the radius, and then the length of the metacarpal, each bone checked twice, his lips moving slightly as he repeated the figures. He wrote nothing down. The numbers were being stored in his hands, in the memory of his fingers, in the quiet, insistent knowledge that a taxidermist builds over years of practice. The right wing received the same attention, the measurements confirming what the left had told him, and then he moved to the legs, measuring the femur, the tibia tarsus, and the tarsus, the hard scales cool under his touch. Each measurement joined the others, a small constellation of numbers that would determine the size and shape of the mannequin he would soon construct. When the measuring was complete, he closed the calipers and set them down, his mind holding the dimensions of the bird as clearly as if he had drawn a diagram on paper. He had done this many times, and the process was so familiar that it felt less like taking measurements and more like having a quiet conversation with the bird, a wordless exchange of form and proportion. The shop around him had brightened further, the high window now glowing with the full light of early morning, and the mist outside had burned away, leaving the street clear and the sky a soft, cloudless blue. The taxidermist straightened up and stretched his shoulders, rolling them once, feeling the slight ache of standing in one position for a long while. He walked to the basin, dipped his hands in the cool water, and dried them on the linen cloth. Then he took a moment to stand near the window and look out at the day, at the carts and pedestrians beginning to fill Fulton Street, at the smoke rising from a chimney across the way, at the ordinary bustle of a city going about its business. The sounds of the street were muted, a distant hum beneath the stillness of the shop, and he let them wash over him without listening to any particular noise. Returning to the bench, He picked up the first scalpel and tested its edge one more time against the light, finding it perfect. He laid it beside the corkboard, the handle angled toward his right hand for easy reaching, and then he lifted the pigeon once more and studied the line he would soon cut along the breast. He traced the path with the tip of his finger, a feather-light touch that parted the plumage to reveal the bare skin beneath, and he nodded to himself as if confirming a decision he had already made. The bird was ready, the tools were ready, the taxidermist was ready. And so he stood a while longer, letting the calm of the morning settle fully over him, before he would pick up the scalpel and make the first incision, the opening of the small world that lay beneath the feathers, still and quiet and full of the memory of flight. The taxidermist stood at the workbench with the passenger pigeon resting on its back upon the corkboard. The morning light now settled into a steady, pale wash that filled the room without glare. Every tool lay in its appointed place, the scalpels, the dish of powdered alum, the pot of arsenical soap, the pliers, snips, needles, thread, forceps, cedar oil, tow, and now a small jar of cornmeal that he had brought from the shelf and placed near his right hand. He picked up a fine brush with a short handle and a tuft of soft badger hair, dipping it into a cup of clean water and tapping off the excess on the rim until the bristles were merely damp, not wet. With his left palm cradling the bird's body to keep it from shifting, he drew the brush in a slow, even line down the center of the breast, parting the feathers with the grain of their natural lie. The plumage separated in two smooth tracts, revealing the bare skin beneath, a pale, translucent membrane that traced the keel of the sternum like the ridge of a small, delicate roof. The damp brush moved again, this time widening the parting just enough that the skin was visible from the base of the throat all the way to the vent. A few loose feathers that had drifted out of alignment were nudged back with the tip of the brush, and the taxidermist blew a soft breath across the exposed line to remove any tiny particles of fluff that might later interfere with the incision. The skin beneath the feathers looked smooth and dry, with a faint bluish tint where the underlying muscle pressed close against it, and a fine network of capillaries could be seen as a ghostly pattern of pale threads. He set the brush aside and reached for the first scalpel, the one he had sharpened to a mirror polish, and held it in his right hand with the same ease a writer holds a pen. He did not cut immediately. Instead, he laid the flat of the blade against the breast, letting the cool steel rest there for a few seconds, allowing the metal and the skin to reach a kind of equilibrium, or perhaps simply giving his own mind a moment to settle into the precise line that would follow. Then he placed the tip of the scalpel at the very top of the keel, just below the hollow of the throat, and pressed downward with a pressure so light it seemed the skin opened more from its own willingness than from the force of the blade. The incision began as a thin, dark line that slowly lengthened as the scalpel traveled down the center of the breast, following the ridge of the bone with a steady, unbroken motion. The edge of the blade separated the skin from the underlying tissue in a clean division, the two sides falling away from each other like the halves of a curtain parting in still air. The taxidermist's hand moved without tremor, his wrist guided by the same patient rhythm that had sharpened the blade earlier, and the sound of the cut was a faint, crisp whisper, so soft it barely reached his ears. The incision continued past the lower curve of the breast and down toward the vent, where he stopped the blade just short of the delicate skin there, withdrawing it with a small upward tilt that left a neat, straight terminus. Now a seam ran the length of the bird's underside, its edges pale and bloodless, the cut having been placed precisely where the feathers would later cover every trace. Where the light caught the raw edge, the tips of severed feather shafts gleamed like tiny dots of polished glass, each one no thicker than a needle. The taxidermist set the scalpel on a clean cloth and took a pinch of cornmeal from the jar, holding it between his thumb and two fingers, then sifted it gently along the length of the incision. The fine pale yellow powder fell like a dusting of snow, clinging to the bare tissue and absorbing any stray moisture before it could dampen the surrounding feathers. He waited a moment for the cornmeal to do its work, then blew the excess away with a soft, directed breath, and the edges of the incision now stood dry and clean. He reached for the bone spatula, its thin, rounded tip worn to an ivory smoothness by years of similar tasks. Starting at the top of the incision near the throat, He slit the spatula under the right edge of the skin, working it sideways with a gentle prying motion that eased the skin away from the body wall beneath. The skin gave way in small increments, the faint yellow layer of subcutaneous fat appearing as a delicate film that stretched and parted, revealing the deeper tissue below. The spatula moved slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the taxidermist's eyes following the separation with close attention, his free hand steadying the bird's body so that no accidental pressure tore the fragile membrane. He advanced along the breast toward the wing socket, pausing whenever he felt resistance, adjusting the angle of the spatula by a fraction, then continuing with the same unhurried, deliberate pace. The fat glistened faintly under the lamplight, and where it gave way to the red-brown layer of muscle beneath, the colors changed as gradually as twilight deepening into night. He repeated the same process on the left side, easing the skin away from the pectoral muscle, the spatula tracing a path that mirrored the first. The pectoral muscle itself became visible now, a dense, fibrous mass that had once powered the bird's long flights, its surface marked by a faint grain like the grain of a well-worn piece of oak. The taxidermist did not cut into the muscle. He only freed the skin from its attachment, allowing the whole breast area to open outward in two clean flaps that he folded back with the spatula onto the corkboard, where they rested like the open covers of a tiny, feather-bound book. The body wall of the pigeon now lay exposed, its architecture clear and orderly, the high curve of the sternum, the sweep of the ribs, the thin, transparent membrane of the abdominal sac beneath the sternum's trailing edge. The taxidermist paused to wipe the spatula on a rag, then placed the tool aside and looked at the open bird with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had completed the first, most critical step without flaw. Now he reached for the scalpel again, this time with a slightly different grip, and began the work of freeing the body from its skin entirely. He inserted the tip of the blade near the throat, severing the thin attachments that bound the skin to the neck, working around the trachea and esophagus with careful little strokes that never dug deeper than necessary. The neck emerged, a slender column of vertebrae wrapped in pale, glistening tissue, and he followed it down toward the shoulders. At the shoulder joints, he used the scalpel to separate the humerus bones from their sockets, cutting through the ligaments with a tiny snap that he felt more than heard. The wings now hung free of the body, attached to the skin only at the outer edges, and he would deal with them later. The legs came next. He loosened the skin from the thighs as far as the knee joints, then severed the femur from the hip with the small shears, their bright steel blades glinting once before they closed with a faint, clean crunch. The body was now loose inside its skin, held only by the remaining connection at the tail and the delicate tissues of the back. Working with both hands, the taxidermist began to turn the skin inside out, pushing the body upward through the incision as one might push a hand through a tight sleeve. The skin peeled back from the back and rump, and the musculature of the lower body appeared, the dark meat of the legs, the smooth curve of the pelvic bone. He used the bone spatula to help ease the skin over the hips, taking extra care not to stretch or tear the parchment-thin dermis. And when he reached the tail, he paused to snick the rectum and the oil gland, freeing the body completely from the final moorings. Now the skin lay on the corkboard, turned inside out, its inner surface exposed to the light, while the whole body of the pigeon, minus the head and the extremities, sat on the board beside it like a small, strangely peaceful sculpture of muscle and bone. The head required special attention. The taxidermist had skinned the body down to the base of the skull, and now he held the skin with his left hand and the scalpel with his right, working the blade carefully around the ear openings, those tiny, feather-fringed hollows that clung to the skin. He cut the thin membrane of each ear canal with a circular motion, freeing the skin without tearing it, then moved to the eyes. The eyelids had to be separated from the eyeball, and he did this with the scalpel held almost flat, sliding it between the two surfaces with a delicacy that came from years of practice, until the skin of the lids came away from the sphere of the eye, without leaving a single cut. The eyes themselves, round and dark, were lifted out whole with a small spoon designed for the purpose, its bowl no larger than a fingernail, and placed in a dish of water where they would be discarded later. The skull now visible, he severed the neck vertebrae with the shears, then worked the skin the rest of the way over the skull, down past the forehead, finally reaching the base of the bill. Here he stopped and used the spoon again to scoop out the brain through the foramen magnum, the opening at the back of the skull, cleaning the interior with small swabs of cotton until the bone cavity was empty and dry. A final wipe with alum inside the skull prepared it for the cotton wadding he would later insert. The skin was now fully separated from the body, inside out, and the taxidermist spread it gently on the cork board. Inner side up, the feathers lying crushed beneath but protected by the board's soft surface. He stretched out the wings, which still held the humerus bones within them, and with the scalpel he freed each bone from the surrounding tissue, cutting away the meat and scraping the shaft clean until the bone gleamed white, then snipping it free at the joint. The legs were treated the same way. He turned them inside out as far as the tarsus, the scalpel slipping beneath the tendon sheaths to scrape every scrap of flesh from the bone, leaving nothing but the clean, hard surface and the thin, flexible tendons that would later be wrapped with thread. The wing bones and leg bones were laid on a piece of brown paper, each one now a tiny architectural element that would support the finished mount. The taxidermist examined each bone briefly, checking for any missed tissue, and then he set them all together in a neat row: the humeri, the tibia-tarsi, the tarsi-metatarsi, a small skeletal inventory of what had once been flight and landing and perch. Throughout this process, the taxidermist paused at intervals to wipe his fingers on the rag that hung from his apron string, removing the slight film of oil and fluid that accumulated on his skin. Each pause was a natural breathing point, a moment when he would glance at the window, note the angle of the sun, listen to the distant sounds of the street, and then return his attention to the bird. His breathing remained steady, a slow rise and fall that matched the pace of his work, and his expression was calm, absorbed, like that of a man reading from a large, quiet book, whose pages turn themselves without any need for haste. The shove around him continued its silent communion with the morning, the smells of alum and camphor and old wood hanging in the air, the dust motes still dancing their lazy spiral in the beam of light from the high window. The scalpel, the shears, the spoon, the spatula. Each had been used and set aside, and now they rested on the bench like the instruments of a gentle surgery that demanded nothing more than patience, attention, and the slow, careful motion of hands that had done this many times before. The skin lay open and empty, and the body lay separate, and between them there was only the space of the workshop, the patient light, and the taxidermist's quiet, methodical presence. With the body of the passenger pigeon now separated from its skin and resting on the corkboard, the taxidermist paused to consider the work that remained before him. The skin lay inverted, its feathers hidden against the soft surface, its inner membrane exposed to the morning light, as a pale, glistening landscape traced with the fine threads of blood vessels, now emptied and still. The body itself sat beside it, a compact form of muscle and bone that still held the shape of the bird it had been, though lifeless and ready to be discarded. Yet before any discarding could happen, the skin required further attention, for the head still clung to the neck opening, the wings still held their bones within their sleeves, and the legs waited to be freed down to the very tips of the toes. The taxidermist straightened his back, rolled his shoulders once, and then reached for the skin with both hands, his fingers finding the edge of the neck opening and beginning the slow, careful work of turning the skin further down over the skull. He worked the skin as a gardener might work a tight glove of soil from a delicate root, easing it downward with small, alternating pulls that never stretched any single spot too far. The feathers on the outside of the skin were protected by the corkboard surface, and the inside surface now slid past the base of the skull, revealing the rounded dome of the cranium beneath its thin layer of connective tissue. The ear openings presented themselves first, two small hollows on either side of the head where the skin dipped inward and adhered with a slight tenacity. The taxidermist took up the scalpel again, its blade still sharp and clean, and with the point he traced a tiny circle around each ear canal, severing the membrane that held the skin to the skull, without cutting the skin itself. A gentle tug confirmed the separation, and the skin moved freely past the ears, sliding down toward the eyes. The eyes were always a delicate matter. The eyelids, those thin rims of skin that had once blinked against wind and light, now needed to be separated from the eyeballs without tearing. He used the scalpel held almost flat against the curve of the eye, the blade slipping between the eyelid and the surface of the eye like a letter opener sliding under a sealed flap. He worked around the circumference of each eye in a series of tiny, patient strokes. the edge of the lid lifting away from the dark, glassy sphere beneath. When both eyelids were free, he set down the scalpel and took up the small spoon with the bent handle, its bowl no larger than a lentil. He slid it behind the left eye, cradling the orb, and with a gentle twist of the wrist he popped it free of its socket, the optic nerves snapping with a sound no louder than a thread breaking. The eye came out whole, its dark brown iris still holding a faint gloss, its black pupil a perfect circle that seemed to stare at nothing. He placed it in the dish of water beside the bench, then repeated the removal on the right side, and a second eye joined the first, the two of them settling on the bottom of the dish like small dark pebbles in a shallow pool. Now the skin could be worked further down, past the forehead, toward the base of the bill. The skull itself was fully exposed, its bone pale and smooth, beneath the remaining scraps of tissue. The taxidermist turned the skin carefully over the bill's base, peeling it away from the horny sheath with the spatula, until the entire head covering was free and lying inside out on the board. He took the small shears and snipped through the neck vertebrae just behind the skull, a single clean cut that separated the head from the rest of the body, and the body itself he set aside in a pail beneath the bench, where it would later be taken out and buried in the small yard behind the shop, returning to the earth from which it had once fed. With the skull now detached and held between his thumb and forefinger, he examined the opening at its base, the foramen magnum, through which the spinal cord had passed. The brain still occupied the cavity within, and it had to be removed completely if the mount was to last without decay. He inserted the tiny spoon through the opening and began a gentle scraping motion, breaking up the soft tissue within and drawing it out in small, pale fragments that he tapped into the waste pail. The spoon moved in slow circles, its edge finding every crevice of the cranial cavity, and when the larger portions had been extracted, he switched to a small wad of cotton held in the forceps, pushing it into the skull and rotating it to absorb the last traces of moisture and tissue. He repeated this 3 times, each fresh wad of cotton emerging slightly cleaner than the last, until the final wad came out as white as it had gone in. A pinch of powdered alum was then introduced into the skull cavity, shaken around by a gentle tilting of the head, and the interior was now dry, clean, and safe from the corruption that time would otherwise bring. The skull was set aside on the brown paper next to the other bones, its empty sockets facing upward like the windows of a tiny abandoned house. The taxidermist then turned his attention to the wings, which still lay inside out on the corkboard, each one attached, one attached to the skin, along to the skin, along the forearm, that holding the bone within its flesh. He lifted the hearer's bone within its flesh. He lifted the left wing and located the humerus with his humerus with his fingers, feeling its hard shape through the skin, using the scalpel. He made a small cut at the elbow joint, then worked the blade beneath the skin to free the humerus from the surrounding muscle, scraping the bone clean with the same careful motion he had used on the skull. The meats came away in thin reddish strips. That he pulled free, with force the force apps and discarded, and soon the bone gleamed, white, its surface smooth and dry. He snipped it at the shoulder end with the shears, leaving just enough of the bone attached to the wing skin to serve as an anchor point for the wire that would later support the wing's position, and then he moved to the right wing and repeated the entire cleaning process, leaving both huma clean and right wing and rightig process, leaving both huma clean entire thekla that live thruxneeded quimsdom canal. The legs came next, and they required the skin to be turned inside out, all the way down to the tarsus, that scaly section of the leg just above, that scaly section of the leg just above the toes. The toes. The taxidermist took hold of the skin at the thigh opening and pushed it downward with his thumbs, inverting the leg skin as one might invert the finger of a tight glove. The skin peeled skin away from the muscle, revealing the dark fibrous meat of the thigh, and the pale shiny tendon that ran down the back of the leg, like a cord. He worked the skin past the knee joint, where a knob of bone required a gentle nudge with the spatula, and then down the drumstick, the skin giving way to expose the tibio-tarsus along the bone that he scraped clean with the scalpel, its surface becoming white and smooth under his ministrations. At the antegankle joint, he encountered the tough tendons that pass through a groove in the bone, and he took care to leave these intact, for they would later be wrapped with thread and anchored to the wire armature. The skin was pushed as far as the tarsus, revealing the fine scales on the inside of the skin, each one a miniature translucent plate, and there he stopped, for the skin beyond that point was too thin and tightly bound to the toe bones to risk further in the toe bones, to rust further the pirate. He cleaned the tibia tarsus of all flesh, wiped it with a rag, and then did the same for the right leg. Tarsus of all flesh, wiped it with a rag, and then did the same for the right leg. The process a mirror of the left, until both leg bones stood clean and bare, their tendon cords still attached, and gleaming faintly in the lamplight. A small basket beside the bench, collected the scraps of tissue, bone fragments, and spent cotton wads. And the taxidermist emptied his hands of the last bit of meat before washing his fingers in the basin of cool water. He dried them on the linen cloth, and then stood for a moment looking at the array before him, the inside out skin, the cleaned wing bones, the inside out skin, the cleaned wing bones, the leg bones with their trailing tendons, the skull with its empty sockets, and the ribs and sternum of the body that still rested in the pail. It was an inventory of parts that had once formed a single living creature, and now they were scattered across the bench, like the pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled into a new unchanging form. The changing form. The taxidermist picked up the skull and turned it over in his hand, feeling the lightness of the bone now that the brain had been removed. He pressed a small wad of cotton into the cranial cavity, packing it firmly, so that the inside would hold its shape and provide a base for the glass eyes, later be the cotton inserted. The cotton was tucked into every hollow, filling the skull. A skull is a cushion. A cushion fills a box. And when he was satisfied with the fit. He set the skull back on the paper. He then took up each wing bone and wrapped a whisper of hemthread around the clean shaft, a single layer, wound in a close spiral from one end to the other, the thread biting into the bone, just enough to give preservative the future paste, something preservative paste, to cling something to, the leg. The leg bones received the same treatment. The thread winding around the tip thread winding around the tibia tarsus andis, and the remaining tendon, in a continuous band that looked like the wrapping on the handle of a fine tool. The morning had advanced while he worked, and the light through the high window had shifted from the cool gray of early dawn to the warmer brighter glow of mid of morning. The dust mote's hades had thinned to a few lazy specks, and the street noises had grown into the steady distant murmur of carts' voices, and the occasional bark of a cart's voices, and the occasional bark of a dog. The taxidermist noticed. Known of none of this consciously, his attention remaining on the bench, where the skin still lay, inverted and waiting. He ran a finger over the inner surface of the skin, of feeling the skin, feeling its texture, checking for any remaining bits of fat or tissue that might need removal. A few small deposits of yellowish fat adhered to the membrane near the rump, and he scraped themed them away with the edge of the spatula, the fat curling into tiny translucent scrolls that he flicked into the waste pail. The skin was now as clean as he could make it, an empty vessel, ready to receive the preservative that would keep it intact for decades, perhaps even a century. In the quiet of the gentleman's cabinet, he straightened up again, and walked to the shelf, where a small bottle of oil of cloves sat among the other supplies. He removed the stopper and upper, and let a single drop fall onto a tuft of cotton, then dabbed this lightly inside the skin of the head, around the bill and eye sockets, where the tissue was thinnest and most prone to drying out before he could apply the arsenical sopical. The scent of cloves filled the air. Briefly, a sweet spicy note that mingled with the camphor and cedar, and then it faded camphor and cedar, and then it faded into the general atmosphere of the up. He stopped shop at the sop of the bottle, returned it to the shelf, and then stood with his hands resting on the edge of the bench, his gaze traveling slowly over the tools, the bones, the skull, the skin, the dish of alum, the waiting, the pot of soap. Everything was ready for the next stage, the skin stage. The skin needed to be treated, be preservative additive, and turned right, turned outside out. The mannequin, the mannequin needed to be formed from toe and wire. The glass eyes needed to be set, and the whole mount needed to be closed and to be closed. But those tasks belonged to the hours ahead, and the tax to the hours ahead, and the taxidermist was in no hurry to meet them. He took a moment to walk to the window and look down at Fulton Street, where the day had fully come to life. A woman in a blue bonnet carried a basket of bread. A boy pulled a small cart, loaded with kindling. Two men stood talking. Two men at the talking corner, with their hands in their pockets, their breath puffing in the cold air. The breath puffing in the cold air. The taxidermist watched them without really seeing them. His mind still half occupied with the tiny bones and the inverted skin, and then he turned away from the window and went back the window and went back the window and went back to the bench where awaited him, like an olden friend whom quiet no compresate. With the skin now turned fully inside out, and spread upon the corkboard like a small pale map of the bird's interior. The taxidermist reached for the squat earthenware pot, that held the arsenical soap. So he lifted the lid and set it aside, and the sharp, clean scent of camphor and minerals rose into the still air of the workshop, joining the existing smells of alum and cedar. The paste inside was the color of old ivory, smooth and thick, with a surface that held the faint impression of a wooden spatula from the last time it had been used. He dipped the flat brush into the pot. Work in the bristles in a slow circle to load them with a thin, even layer of the soap. The soap then tapped the brush once against the inner rim to remove the excess. Any excess, the taxidermist bent over the open skin and began at the neck, where the delicate tube of the throat had been separated from the skull. He painted the soap onto the inner surface with short, smooth strokes. The bristles gliding over the membrane and leaving behind a translucent film that caught the light in a faint, greasy sheen. He worked the brush into every fold that the skinning had left behind. The small pockets where the ears had been attached. The narrow channels that had held the eyelids, the creases at the corners of the bill where the skin was the thinnest. His noth. His hand moved with the same unhurried, methodical rhythm that had guided the scalpel, and he paused now and then to reload the brush, the lid resting beside his resting elbow like a small brown shield. From the neck he pot lid resting beside his resting elbow like a smaller brown shield. From the progress down neck. He to the progress down to the wing sockets, turning the skin. The skin slightly on the board. So that the light from the lamp fell directly into the hollow where the humerus had been severed. The arsenical soapical soap was worked into the entire circumference of each opening. The opening, brush tracing the rim again and again, until the raw tissue there had absorbed as much of the paste as it could hold. The taxidermist knew that the wing sockets would be points of tension later, places where the wire armature would press against the inner skin, and so he gave them extra attention, loading a second on top thin coat on top of the first, and smoothing it with the flat of the brush until the surface gleave the flat of the brush until the susceptible care out full the interior. The interior of the skull required a different tool. He set aside the brush and selected a slim wooden rod with a small wad of cotton twisted onto its tip. Its tipping dipping the cotton into the arsenical soap and inserting it carefully through the opening at the back of the skull. The paste coated the inner bone surface as he rotated the rod with a gentle twisting motion, the cotton swabbing, the pabbing, the contours of the cranium where the brain had once rested. He withdrew the rod. Examined the rod, examined the cotton, found it still carrying a trace of the cotton, found it still carrying a trace of pale soap, and repeated the action a second time to ensure that the entire interior was covered. The base of the bill received the same treatment, a tiny application of paste that he pushed into the narrow space with a thin slip of wood, no wider than a matchstick. The legs were still inside out down to the tarsus. The taxidermist now turned his attention to them, painting the inner skin of each leg with the brush. The brush covering the place the femur had separated from the hip, and working the soap into the tubular sheaths that had held the tendons, and the tendons the path. The skin here was tougher than elsewhere, with a texture more like fine leather, and it accepted the paste with a kind of thirsty eagerness, the soap sinking in and dulling to a matte finish almost at once. He added a second application to each leg, waiting a moment between coats for the material to settle, moving to the main expanse of the body skin. The taxidermist brushed the soap across the inner surface in long overlapping sweeps, steps covering every inch from the neck, all the neck way to the tail. The membrane here was thin and translucent, marked with a fine web of blood vessels that were now empty and pale, and the soap gave it a pearly sheen that made the membrane look like a thin sheet of waxed paper. He worked around paper, the membrane look like a thin sheet of wax of paper. He worked around paper. He worked around the vent with extra care, using only the tip of the brush to dab the soap into the circle of tissue without tearing it. And then he did the same for the oil gland, at the base of the tail, which he had left in place because removing it would have left a noticeable hollow in the finished mount, the brush mount. The brush moved across the entire inner landscape of the bird, leaving no fold untouched. And when he was finished, he set the brush down on the scrap of brown paper and pressed the lid back onto the pot of soap with a firm, even pressure that made a soft sealing sound. The skin was now preserved, but there were small tasks still to be done before it could be set aside to rest. The taxidermist examined the inner surface one final time, holding it close to the lamp, his spectacles catching a glint of flame as he leaned in. He noticed a few speck of dry blood that had clung to the base of a breast feather, draft feather shaft, and had been overlooked during the skinning. These specks were tiny, no larger than grains of sand, dark against the pale inner membrane. And though they would not harm the skin, the taxidermist believed in thoroughness. He filled a small cup with lukewarm water from the kettle. That sat on the spirit lamp swarming ring. The water having been heated just enough to take the chill from the room. Into the water he dipped a sable brush. The smallest and softest he owned. Its tip coming to a fine point that could touch a single feather bar without disturbing its neighbors. He turned the skin the right side out, with a series of slow, careful manipulations, easing the neck back through itself, pulling the wings through the wing openings, and guiding legs down, through their sheaths. Legs glads, don't at these skin lay on the corkboard. With the outermost feathers and outer arrangements the mincage in line, but the plumage, the velold is just restored as drashjatrak money bitty beater coin the breast feathers lay smooth over the chest, and the throat shimmered with iridescence once more, while the soft pink of the breast caught the lamp in a warm glow. The taxidermist located the specks of dried blood, a few tiny dots near dried blood, a few tiny dots near the lower edge of the breast where the incision had passed, and he touched the moistened sable brush to reach each speck in turn. Letting the water dissolve dried the matter over the course of several, the gentle daps of the bow for the course of the thick as the blood softened, he blotted it away with a scrap of clean cotton rag, repeating the process until the feathers showed no trace of the discoloration. He then dried the area by pressing a pinch of powdered chalk against the damp feathers the chalk absorbing the moisture, within seconds, after which he dusted it off with a soft puff of breath and a light stroke of the cotton rag, the Pigeon. The feathers were now clean, dry, and unmarked, and they lay in their proper order, as though nothing had ever disturbed them. Satisfied with the plumage, the taxidermist turned the skin inside out, once more, reversing the process with the same slow precision, he had used before, and laid it inner side up on a fresh sheet of clean brown paper that he had torn from a roll and smoothed flat with his palm. The brown paper made a soft, rustling sound. A sound as he arranged the skin upon it, folding upon it the wings, the wings and legs into a compact, orderly shape, so that no part of the skin extended the paper's edges. He covered beyond the paper's edges. He covered the skin the second sheet of brown of primaverational taken of prombostenical soap had time to penetrate the tissue and tickered the skin with a timed time to penetrate the tissue and do its quiet invisible work, and he set this package at the far quarter of the tax. The taxidermometers and continue attention to the brown paper at the side of the bench. The two humeri, the two teviatasia, the two tarsimeter, and the tanger bones. Tiny bones, the tiny bones at the tenditometatars, and the tiny bones of the tid of clended blangetabent that he pulled strong. He pulled the spirit lamp a little closer, so that the circle of light fell directly on light, fell directly on the row of bones, and he reached for the scalpel with the finest point the one he reserved for delicate scraping work, holding the first humerus between his left thumb and forefinger. He inspected it against the light, turning it slowly. The bone was white and clean for the most part, but a thin fibrous film. Still the rouge clung to film. Still the rouge minged area near the shoulder joint. A patch of periosteum that had resisted the earlier cleaning. He set the edge of the scalpel against this scalpel film, and against this film, and scraped with tiny controlled motions. The blade making a soft gritty sound as it removed the last of the tissue, leaving the bone the first smooth surface, smooth and dry. He repeated the process with the other humerus, then moved on to the tibia tarsi ariaza, which had a similar film near the knee joints, and then to the tars summatato metatarsi ariaza, whose long slender shafts were ridged with fine longitudinal grooves that required that scalpel tip to be drawn along and groove. It reward just twice the wing bones still attached to the remnants at the primary feather shafts received a different kind of attention. They scraped the ulna and radius with the scalpel, cleaning the interosseous space where space a thin membrane had once stretched between the two bones, and then he used a small file to smooth the cut ends of the humor, where the shear had left a slightly roughed edge, slightly rough, the file edge. The file was a slender slip, a steel with a fine grit, and it sang a high, thin note as he drew it across the bone. The bone a sound as quiet as the mosquito. A mosquito's whine, fading to silence when he lifted the tool away. The dust from the filing was a fine white powder that he brushed onto the brown paper and later folded into a small packet for disposal. When all the bones were clean to his satisfaction, the taxidermist opened a small drawer and removed a spool of fine hemp thread, the color of light brown sugar, twisted with a tight even spin that made it strong and slightly rough to the touch. He cut a length of thread with the snips and drew it across the block of beeswax. Several times. The wax coating the fibers and giving them the faint pleasant scent, and a slight tackiness, that the thread would helpiness, that the thread gripped the bone. He pinched the end of the thread between his thumb and forefinger, twisted it into a tiny point, and began to wrap it around the cleaned end of the first. The first humorous starting right at the cut, an edge and winding in a tight, neat spiral that moved down the shaft, neat spiral that moved down the shaft. The passuri. The thread lay cast flat against the bone, each turn pressed close to the previous one, forming a smooth even bandage that covered the raw bone surface just a distance of perhaps of half an inch. This wrapping would serve as an anchor for the wire armature when it was later inserted, and it would also give the preserved tendons something to adhere to, something that mimicked the texture of living tissue. He tied off the thread with a small hidden knot, trimming the loose end with it the texture of living tissue. He tied off the thread with a small hidden knot, trimming the scalpel tip, and then he repeated the loose end with the scalpel tip. And then he repeated the process on the other humerus, then on each tibia tarsus, and then on each tibia tarsus, winding a tar, then on our thread each tarsametatarsis, winding a tarsus, winding the hemp thread with kale meets out the tax. The taxidermist gathered the wrapped bones and set them in a small glass dish, which he placed the brown package paper containing the skin, the dish skin, and the dish package sat together at the edge of the workbench, quiet and orderly, their contents ready for the next stage of the work. He wiped the scalpel blade on a rag and returned it to its case, then did the same with the file and the sheet contents ready for the next stage of the work. He wiped the scalpel blade on a rag and returned it to its case, then did the same with the file and the shears, eyes, closing the wooden box and sliding it back into the drawer, the small cup of lukewarm water. He emptied into the sink, and the sable brush. He brushed, he rinsed, shaped to a point with his A-point, with his lips, and laid flat on a scrap of blotting, pappeting paper to dry. The morning had now passed into early afternoon, and the afternoon, and the light from the high window had shifted again. The window had shifted again, the rectangle of sun climbing up the opposite wall, and catching the edge and catching over the shelf lined with small glass jars. The jars held various preserved specimens, a few specimens, a few dried beetles. A small snake, coiled in spirits, the wing of a blue jay kept for reference, and a collection of seeds, that a previous customer had asked to have identified. The sunlight made the glass glitter, and for a moment the shelf looked like a row of tiny lanterns, each one holding a fragment of the natural world suspended in stillness. The taxidermist stepped back from the bench and surveyed the shop, each one holding a fragment of the natural world suspended in stillness. The taxidermist stepped back from the bench and surveyed the shop. Everything was in order. The tools cleaned and put away or arranged neatly for the next use. The skin and bones stored safely. The floor swept of any stray feathers or bits of cornmeal. He untied his apron, shook it out once, and hung it on a peg near the door. Then walked basin and to the washed his basin and washed his hands thoroughly, with soap and cold water, scrubbing water under his nails, with a stiffer brush until no trace of the austinical paste remained. He dried his hands on the linen cloth, and stood for a while, near the window, walking down at Fulton Street, where the afternoon traffic had tuned to a few pedestrians walking with their coat collars turned against, up a breeze that had begun to stir the dust in the gutters, a quiet sense of completion settled over him. Not the satisfaction of a task finished, because the mount was far from done, but from done the calm, but that comes the calm, that comes when one stage of a long process been carried out with care and without error. The skin was preserved, the bones were wrapped, and the materials for the mannequin were waiting in their basket and their jars. The taxidermist allowed himself a few more minutes of stillness. His hands resting on the windowsill, his eyes following a single cloud that drifted across the pale sky above the rooftops. Then he turned back to the bench, lifted the brown paper package and the glass dish of bones, and carried bones and them to the rear shelf where they would sit overnight, safe and undisturbed, while the arsenical soap continued its slow penetration, and the hemp thread dried tight, dried a bone ends. Key. He to this pitted of a sign guided distinct fainted thicket rich Steve forwarded to the center of the room and stood moving at some of the fading character of the drawing to the center that the identities of the dividing east might finally stand into the type data might the dane kids the mind that the died the named fight of it to fight in the water and that the bike debate had up about the better debated it. The addressed. The taxidermist must return to the work. The workbench early the The next morning, the light through the high window, still carrying the cool, silvery quality. Of dawn, he had slept. He without disturbance had slept without disturbance. His quarters quiet, save for the occasional creak. The occasional creak of the buildings timbers. And he felt rested. In the way that comes from simple routine and a clear purpose, waiting in the shop, the brown package paper containing the preserved skin sat where he had left it on the rear shelf, the smooth river, rock still holding it, flat, and the glass dish of wrapped of bones rested beside it, each bone gleaming faintly through the dish's curved wall. He brought both to the bench, setting them down with care, and then he turned to the drawer where he kept his wire, the fur. The drawer opened with a soft wooden sound, revealing several coils of brass wire in different gauges. Each coil held in a neat loop by a twist of its own end. Some of the wire was thin and flexible, suitable for small songbirds, while another coil was thicker, meant for larger specimens like grouse or small mammals. The taxidermist selected a coil of medium gauge wire. That wire that was sturdy enough to support the pigeon's body, but pliable enough to bend without matting. And he unrolled snapping, and he unrolled the length of it. Across the bench, the brass catching the lamplight in a warm coppery gleam, mirror gleam. He straightened the section by drawing it through a folded piece of leather several times the wire emerging smooth and true. Using the brass calipers, he recalled the measurements. He had measurements he had taken 2 days prior. The numbers rising in his mind, as clearly as if he had written them on paper. Total length, width of breast, depth of body, length of each wing, length of bone, each wing distance from bone, distance from hip to knee, from knee to ankle, from knee to ankle. He measured the wire against these remembered figures marking the spots with a tiny scratch from the point of an awl, one of an awl. One mark for the base. The base of the skull, another for the beginning of the neck. A third for the shoulder junction, another pair for the hips, and final marks for the tips of the wing wires, leg wires. The awl left small bright scratches on the brass surface, each one a precise coordinate in the arm. The armature he was about to construct. He cut the wire with the heavy snips. A tool with short jaws and long handles that. Multiplied his hand strength, and the wire parted with a clean, dry snap. the central wire which would run from the skull base through the neck and down the body cavity to the tail was the longest piece spanning nearly the full length of the bird. He then cut two shorter wires for the wings, two for the legs, and a final short piece that would reinforce the tail. Each cut wire was laid on the bench in a row. Their ends aligned, and the taxidermist picked them up, one by one, to file the cut tips smooth so that no sharp edge would later tear the skin from within. The bending of the wire began at the head end, using a pair of round nose pliers with smooth polished jaws. He formed a smaller loop at the very tip of the central wire, a loop that would sit inside the skull, and provide an anchor point for the cotton wadding he had already packed there. Below this loop he made a gentle curve to follow the shape of the neck, bending the wire by small degrees, testing the angle against his memory of the bird's posture. A slope that descended from the skull, the two snoldered shoulders in a smooth, natural line. The wire yielded line. The wire to the pliers with a soft metallic creak, and he moved slowly, correcting the curve by tiny increments, feeling the shape with his fingers as a blind man might read a face. At the shoulder point he formed a fork. Here the two wing wires would be attached, and he achieved this by taking one of the shorter wires and wrapping its midpoint around the central wire. The central wire in a tight and neat twist, using the pliers to cinch the coils together, so the junction was as small and compact as possible. The wing wires now extended outward on either side like the crossed either side like the crossed arms of a tiny scarecrow, and he bent each one at the proper angle to follow the natural lie of the hum, the humorescieris, then added a second bend at the elbow, where the wing would fold, and a gentle taper at the tip that would slide into the cleaned wing bones. The leg wires were attached in a similar fashion, wrapped around the central wire at the hip. The hip point, their ends bent backward slightly to match the angle of the thighs, then directed downward through an imaginary drumstick and ankle to the tarsuses. He twisted a final short wire around the tail end of the central spine, fanning its tips outward to support the long tail, fanning its tips outward to support the long tail feathers that would later be arranged. The armature lay on the bench. At the bench a skeletal thing of brass, gleaming yet angular. Yet it held within its angles, the exact proportions of the bird that had once flown. The taxidermist lifted it, and turned it in the light, checking each junction, each bend, each loop, and he found it sound. The wires The wires did not shift or slip, and the under twists were tight enough that the toe and thread he would later add, would not loosen them. Satisfied, he set the armature, not loosen them. Satisfied, he set the armature aside on the cork. The cork board and reached for board, and the basket reached for the basket of toe fiber that sat on the floor beside his stool. The toe was a mass of light brown, tangled strands that came from old hemp rope that had been picked apart and beaten the fibers separated into a soft, fluffy mass. It smelled of dry plant matter, of dust and sundust and sun, and the faint salt tang of its former life as ship's rigging. The taxidermist took a handful and pulled the fibers apart with his fingers, loosening the clumps and removing a few small bits of foreign matter, a splinter of wood, tiny fragment of shell, a dark speck that might been a bit of old tar. The cleaned handful went into a small pile on the bench, and he continued this process until a sizable mound of fluffy, even toe, sat ready for use. He also brought out a spool of strong linen thread, the color of unbleached cotton, and a small pot of paste made from wheat flour and water that mixed fresh. He had mixed fresh that morning. The paste was still warm from the heating, and it gave off a faint brye scent, bready scent that mingled with the camphor and cedar. He set the paste pot within easy reach, its surface smooth and pale. A small wooden spreader resting across its rim. Now he picked the wire armature and a handful of towel, and he began the slow patient work of building the mannequin, starting at the neck. He wrapped a thin loose bundle of toe around the central wire, twisting it gently into a rough cylinder that approximated the thickness the bird's neck. He wound the linen thread over this bundle thread, binding the toe to the wire in a close spiral, the thread pulling the fibers tight so that the neck form became firm, but still had a slight give, the way living flesh yields to gentle pressure. He added more toe and then more thread, working his way up toward the skull, up toward loop and the skull loop, and down toward the shoulders, constantly running his thumb and forefinger along the form to gauge its techness, comparing it to the measurements he had taken. When the neck matched the recorded girth, he tied off the thread and moved on. The body was the largest part of the man, the mannequin and it demanded the most tau. He He built it up, layer by layer, laying thin sheets of fiber along the along the wire, smoothing them with his palm, binding them palm, with thread, binding them with thread, and then repeating the process. The shape gradually emerged from the wrapped bundle, a soft void form, ovoid form that swelled at the breast and tapered at the tailor. He worked the toe with his fingers pinching and pressing, rounding the curve of the crop area, just above the sternum. The sternum hollowing slightly the place where the wings would fold, building up the rump with a few extra wisps of fiber. The paste came into use now. A thin smear applied to the thread wraps in strategic spots, tacking thread wraps in strategic spots, tacking down any loose fibers and giving the mannequin a slightly stiffened surface that would hold its shape against the inward shape, against pressure of the inward pressure. The skin of the inward trape against pressure of the inward pressure the skin. He used the paste sparingly, a dab here and there, spreading it flat with the wooden spatula and the scent of wheat and warm water rose briefly before fading. Several times during the construction, the taxidermist paused to test the mannequin's size. Thicken's size. He lifted the preserved skin from its brown paper wrapper, handling it with care. The inner surface still tacky in places from the astenical sobic. Strew soap. He drew the skin loosely over the mannequin, not yet the final closure, just checking the fit of the neck against the skin of the throat, the width of the breast against the span, of the open incision, the skin draped over the toe body like a coat being tried on in a tailor's shop, and the taxidermist observed where the fit was too tight, where a little extra toe would fill out a hollow, where the curve of the back needed a slight adjustment. He removed the skin. Added the skin a pinch, added of toe a pinch of toe to the spot that needed it, bound it down, tested again, and continued this slow, iterative process until the mannequin filled the skin smoothly from neck to tail, with lumps or gaps or empty pockets. The wing wires were wrapped with tow as well, but more thinly, just enough to give a soft padding over the brass before they would be inserted into the cleaned humerus bones. The taxidermist twisted a small amount of fiber, around each wing wire, smoothing it with dampened fingers so that it clung tightly, and then he bound it with thread. The resulting cylinder no thicker than goose quill. The resulting cylinder no thicker than a goose quill. The leg wires received similar treatment, padded with tow and bound with thread. Their thickness graduated to match the natural taper of the leg from thigh to ankle. The toe wrapping on the legs was slightly firmer than on On the wings for the legs would bear the weight of the mounted bird on its perch, and the extra firmness would prevent sagging over time. The taxidermist had now been working for over 2 hours, ready rhythm of toe and thread and paste, and the mannequin lay on the bibidi before him, a strange and somewhat spectral object, the rough brown toe wrapped in pale linen thread, the brass wires protruding at the wing dade, the brailed bite like that the bird guide called. He stood back and looked at it, turning it this way and that, checking its profile against the memory of the live pigeon silhouette, and he made a few final adjustments, a tiny tuft final adjustments, a tiny tuft of toe added to the left side of the breast where the muscle had been, slightly fuller, a smoothing of the thread near the tail where the tail'll be a snout midels be the much thad formed. Then he set the mannequin down and wiped his hands on the apron rag, leaving a faint smear of wheat paste on the cloth. One more component remained before the skin. The skin could be closed over the form. The sea caster. The taxidermist opened a small wooden box. That box that sat on a high shelf, lifting the lid to reveal rows of glass eyes, nestled in individual compartments. Lined with black velvet. The eyes came in pairs, each pair wrapped in each pair, a twist of tissue wrapped in a twist of tissue paper, and they ranged from tiny specks suitable for hummingbirds to larger orbs meant for hawks, for horror or owls. He searched through the box until he found a pair marked with a small paper tag that read passenger pigeon mail. He unwrapped them and held them in his palm, two small spheres of brown glass, with a soft black pupil at the pater and a delicate rim of brown the bird days before they rode. The colours matching exactly the hard kisses of the big geese. Right here, that eyes was the glass eyes caught the light and seemed to hold a tiny spark of life within their depths, though they were only glass and pigment, inert and unchanging. He set the eyes aside on a clean cloth, and then retrieved the skull from the row of bones. The cotton he had packed inside the cranial of bones. The cotton he had packed inside the cranial cavity had dried to a firm, slightly springy massy mass, and he used the tip of the forceps to press it down a baking fraction, making room for the wire loop that would soon be inserted. He then took a small wad of fresh tow and wrapped it tightly with linen thread, shaping it into a ball that matched the size of the original eyeball. Repeating the process to make a second ball, the two of them sitting like tiny pale marbles on the cloth beside the glass. These toe balls would fill the eye sockets, providing a soft, firm backing firm backing against which the glass eyes would rest, and the thread wrapping would prevent the fibers from working loose over time. The taxidermist positioned the skull and cull on the cork board with the empty sockets facing upward. He took He took one of the towel balls, dipped it very lightly in the wheat paste and pressed it into the left socket, seating it firmly, but not forcefully. The paste acting as a mild adhesive that would hold the ball in place. The paste acting as a mild adhesive that hold the ball in place. The second toe ball went into the right socket in the same way, and he used the flat end of the bone spatula to press them level with the rim of the socket, creating a smooth, creating a smooth over each toe ball. He positioned a glass eye. The convex surface facing outward, the flat back pressing against the decon. He adjusted the eyes with the tip of the forceps, rotating each one by tiny increments until the pupils aligned with each other, and the yellow rims sat evenly within the circle of the eyelids. The eyes stared upward at the ceiling, blank and calm, their gaze fixed on nothing, and yet they seemed to hold. The quiet attention of a living bird resting on a branch, watching the slow movement of leaves. The taxidermist let them settle for a moment, and then he lifted the skull and attached it to the wire loop at the top at the mannequin, sliding the loop into the cotton-filled cavity, and pressing down gently until the skull seated firmly against the neck formed the mannequin. The mannequin and skull now formed one continuous assembly, wire and toe and bone joined together into a single armature that held the exact shape of the passenger, the pigeon. The taxidermist lifted the whole structure and carried it to the window where the morning light had grown brighter, spilling through the glass in a broad, even flood that illuminated every thread and fiber. He turned the mannequin slowly, checking it from every angle, looking for any asymmetry or imperfection, and he found none. The shape was true, the proportions were right, and the glass eyes gleamed in the sunlight as they would gleam for years to come, would gleam for years to come in the quiet cabinet on the tree-lined street. He brought the mannequin back to the bench and laid it on a clean sheet of paper. The preserved skin still waited in its brown paper wrapper. At the corner of the bench, and the taxidermist looked at it for a long moment, feeling the quiet anticipation that always came just before the final assembly. Hardest work. The hardest work was done, was done. The hardest work was done, was done. The bird had been skinned and cleaned, the bones cleaned, the bones had been scraped and wrapped, the skin had been preserved, and the mannequin had been built to the precise dimensions of the living creature. What remained was the closing of the skin, the stitching of the incision, the arrangement of the feathers, and the positioning of the bird on its perch. But those tasks belonged to the next part of the day, and the taxidermist was content to let them wait a little longer, standing in the warm light of the workshop, with the half-finished mount before him, and the silence of the morning wrapped around him, like a familiar, comfortable coat. The taxidermist stood before before the workbench, with the morning light falling across his hands, the mannequin and the preserved skin laid out before him like two halves of a quiet puzzle that had waited patiently through the night. The shop was still. The only sounds, the distant murmur of Fulton Street, and the occasional soft pop of the spirit lamps flame, which he had lit again, to warm the air near the bench, and make the skin more supple. He had already checked the mannequin, one final time, running his thumb along the toe body to confirm the body to smoothness, confirm the smoothness of its contours, testing the firmness of the neck, verifying that the glass eyes were still set evenly sockets, the skin lay its in live leisure. The inner surface coated with the pale dry film of the arsenical soap, and the outer plumage. When he lifted it gently, it shimmered with the same iridescence he had admired as the frotes, shifting as the flight moved across them. The throat, the purrs shifted by. He began by turning the skin right side out for the last time. A process now familiar from the reversing he had done earlier. The skin eased through itself with a soft rustling whisper. The neck emerging first, and then the breast, the wings, the back, the tail, until the whole skin lay on the cork. The cork board with the feathers, the outermost in the incision, gaping along the belly. The plumage had held its arrangement well. The feather tracts lying in their natural order, and only a few small areas needed a touch of the moistened brush to coax a feather back into alignment. He dampened the badger hairbrush in the cup of water, tapped off the excess, and drew it lightly across the crown of the head, where a few small feathers had lifted, then across the throat, smoothing iridescent patch into a seamless shimmer. The skin looked almost alive in its completeness, hollow, a hollow perfect replica of the bird it had been, waiting only to be filled. The mannequin lay beside it, The brass wires gleaming the brass, at the wires gleaming wing, and at the wing and leg joints, the frothy toe body, wrapped in its neat linen thread. The thread, the skull, attached at the top, at the width, the glass top with the glass eyes, reflecting a tiny tiny crick of flame from the lamp, the taxidermist took a moment to dust the mannequin lightly with powdered chalk, brushing it over the toe with a soft rag, so that any remaining tackiness from the wheat paste would not catch on the inner membrane of the skin. The chalk fell in a fine white film, and he tapped the mannequin gently against the bench to shake away the excess, a small cloud of particles rising and settling in the still air. Now he lifted the skin and held it over the mannequin, aligning the opening of the neck with a toe neck of the form, that the skin descended slowly. The taxidermist using both hands to guide it, his fingers spread to distribute the tension evenly across the membrane. The neck skin slid over the toe neck with a gentle friction. The glass eyes disappearing under the eyelids, then reappearing as the skin passed over the skull. The bill emerging through the small opening at the front. The feathers of the crown settling into place over the cotton and piked cock and cranion kabbalah. He used the tuler to bone spatula to ease the skin over the back of the skull, tucking it down carefully where the ear openings had been, making sure the eyelids sat snugly around the glass eyes, their thin rims framing the brown and yellow orbs in a natural living expression. The skin moved down over the shoulders next, and here the taxidermist paused to guide the wing wires through the openings in the skin, threading each wire into its corresponding wing sleeve, with a patient sleeve with the openest, with a corresponding wing sleeve with the openest ray, a narrow channel, a fine cord through a narrow channel. The toe-padded wire slid into the cleaned humerus bone with a slight satisfying resistance. He pushed it home until the bone seated against the shoulder junction, the wing now attached to the body, the mannequin, with a firm internal connection. He repeated the step on the other side, and both the other side and both wings hung from the body in their proper positions. The feathers of the shoulders covering the shoulders, the joints covering the joints like a small neat cape. The legs were next, and they required a similar threading. The leg wires sliding down through the thigh skin and into the wrapped, the tibiotarsus bones, the brass disappearing inside the cleaned bone shafts, until only the tips protruded to the ankles, the taxidermist to work the skin down over the body form, pulling it gently it gently from the breast toward the tail, the tail, the tail, the toe mannequin, filling the cavity with an even, firm pressure that pushed the breast feathers outward into their natural rounded shape. He watched the contour of the bird emerge as the skin settled, the pinkish cinnamon, breast glowing and glowing in the lamp light, the gray brown back smoothing over, the curve of the toe, the folded wings coverts falling into place over the folded wings. The folded wings coverts falling into place over the folded wings. The bird looked whole. Its form restored. The only sign of the work that had been done, the open incision that still ran along the belly, a gap that would now be closed with silk. The taxidermist reached for one of the curved needles that rested in the red flannel cushion. Selecting a slender one with slight arc threaded with fine silk that he had waxed earlier. The silk was so thin it was nearly invisible. A single dark filament that caught the light only when it turned at a certain angle. He held the needle in his right hand, and the forceps in his left, the forceps ready to grasp the edges of the skin and hold them in alignment while he stitched. Before beginning, he used the moistened brush to dampen the edges. The edges of the incision, just enough to make the skin pliable and prevent it from curling inward. As he worked, he started the first stitch at the top of the incision near the base of the throat, inserting the needle through the right edge of the skin from the inside out, then crossing over to the left edge and passing the needle from the outside needle from in. The silk followed the needle through the tiny holes, pulling the two edges together with a gentle, even tension. The tension that he controlled with his forefinger, never hard enough to pucker the skin, only enough to bring the edges into contact. The stitch was a simple continuous overcast, each pass of the needle taking a small bite of the membrane, the bites spaced as evenly as the teeth of a fine comb, each one no more than the sixteenth of an inch from the next. The silk lay flat against the skin, its dark color blending with the shadow of the incision. And as the taxidermistum progressed down the breast, the gap that gradually closed, the two sides merging into a single unbroken surface. The broken surface, the needle moved in a slow, steady rhythm, dipping and rising, the silk trailing behind it like a tiny dark stream, and the taxidermist's hand maintained the same unhurried pace that guided every step of this work. He paused now and then to check the alignment of the feathers along the seam, using the forceps tops to gently lift a feather, gently lift barb, that a feather barb that had slipped under the edge of the skin, edge of repositioning at the skin, edge of repositioning at the skin, repositioned so that it lowered over the stitches and concealed them completely. The breast feathers with their soft pinkish tips fell over the closed incision as naturally as pinkish tips fell over the closed incision as naturally as they had before the closed incision, as naturally as they had before the cut was made, and the seam could be seen, seam could only if be seen, seam could only if be seen, seam could only if one knew exactly where to look, and parted the plumage with a deliberate touch. When the stitching reached the lower belly, just above the vent, the taxidermist tied off the silk, with a small hidden knot, looping the thread around the needle several times, and drawing it tight, then snipping the threads. With the tips of his scissors, a tiny pair of silver shears clicked once and went silent. He tucked the knot under the edge of the skin with the point of the forceps, and forceps the incision, and the incision was now completely closed. The silk buried beneath the feathers, the bird body's body sealed and whole. The tax sealed and whole. The taxidermist set down the needle and forceps, and wiped his fingers on the rag. Then he used the palm of his hand to smooth the breast feathers downward, a single, gentle stroke that settled the plumage into its final arrangement. Now, the wings needed attention. The taxidermist lifted the left wing with his left hand, supporting its weight at the humerus, and with his right hand, he took up a pair of long forceps, their tips wrapped in a thin layer of cotton, to prevent them from marking the feathers. He used the forceps to reach into the wing and grasp the tips of the primary feathers, those long stiff flight feathers that fanned out at the wing's trailing edge. One by one, he drew each primary into its proper position, arranging them in a natural overlapping sequence. The longest primaries outermost, the shorter ones rated beneath. Each feather lying flat against the next, with the precision of a carefully shuffled cards. The secondaries received the same treatment, aligned along the ulna, their edges forming a smooth continuous line that followed the curve of the wing. The coverts, those smaller feathers that overlay the wing. Those smaller feathers that overlay the bases of the flight feathers, were nudged into place with the tip of the forceps, their soft, rounded tips forming a neat protective layer that resembled the scales of a fish. The right wing was arranged in mirror image. The taxidermist working with the same slow attention. His eyes moving back and forth between the two wings to check that they matched in symmetry. A small straight feather on the right wing, a covert that had twisted slightly, during the skinning, was coaxed back into alignment with the moistened brush, its barbs re-interlocking, under the gentle stroke, and the brush lifted away, the lifted way feather lay flat and true. The wings now rested against the body, in the folded position of a bird at ease. There at ease, their tips crossing just above the tail, the flight feathers forming a dark, pointed silhouette against the lighter brown of the back. The taxidermist turned to Nust, then turned to the tail, he coined to Demodant. The taxidermist turned to the tail, he lifted the long pointed tail feathers with the forceps, spreading them into a fan that extended from the base of the rump. The rump tail of a passenger. A passenger pigeon was notably long and graduated. The central feathers, the longest feathers, the outer feathers, stepping down in length, like the pipes of a small organ. He arranged them on a small card of stiff grey board that he had cut to the proper width, fixing each feather in place by inserting a fine steel pin through the shaft of the feather and into the feather, and into the card. The pin driven at a shallow angle so that it held the feather without splitting the quill. The pins were the sort that a seamstress might use, slender and sharp, their heads no larger than that a seamstress might use, slender and sharp, their heads no larger than a pinhead. He inserted them one by one, spacing them evenly. Until all 12 tail feathers were spread in a perfect symmetrical fan, the barb smoothed flat with a touch of the finger. The whole arrangement held rigid and still. He set the whole arrangement held rigid and still. He set the card aside on the bench. The tail now fixed in its open position, and he turned back to the body of the bird, where a few small adjustments still remained. The breast feathers had settled well, but a tiny gap near the shoulder caught his eye. A place where the skin had pulled slightly away from the mannequin during the stitching. He took a pinch of toe, rolled it into a minute pellet between his thumb and forefinger, and inserted it through the skin at the wing opening, using the forceps to push into the hollow, and fill out the contour. The gap disappeared. The feathers disappeared. The feathers resumed their smooth continuous surface, and the taxidermist nodded to himself, a small inward gesture that no one else would have seen. The feet and legs still trailing their wire extensions, hung loose below the body, and the taxidermist addressed them addressed. He them next. He bent the leg wise into a natural perching posture. The ankles angled slightly, the toes curled inward as if gripping a branch. The toes themselves were still flexible. The skin having been preserved, but not yet preserved, but not yet fixed in position. And he used the forceps to arrange each toe, the three forward pointing digits, and the single rear pointing hallux, all curled into a gentle grasp. The tiny claws, dark and sharp, were aligned so that they pointed downward, ready to hook over the surface of the perch. The scales, the surface of the perch, the scales on the tarsus, those minute overlapping plates had dried to a pale pinkish grayish gray, and he applied a tiny drop of cedar oil to a cotton swab, and rubbed it over the scales, restoring a slight natural sheen that made the legs look living, the bread of the fed, the tham preserved. The taxidermist stepped back from the bench, his hands falling to his hands, his sides falling to his sides, and he looked at the mounted bird for the first time as a whole rather than as a collection of parts. The passenger pigeon sat on his workbench, still unattached to a perch, to a still pinned perch, at the tail, yet it possessed a quiet completeness that filled the small space around it. The breast rose and fell in a smooth, unbroken curve. The throat shimmered with its threefold iridescent sides essence. The wings folded neatly against the flanks. The head turned just slightly to one side, as if the bird had heard a smaller sound in the undergrowth and paused growth, and to consider it paused. The glass eyes, brown and yellow, held the light in a way that seemed almost warm, though they were only glass, only pigment, only the careful arrangement of inert matter. The shop around the bird was quiet, the morning having passed into early afternoon, the light through the high window shifting again toward the golden angle of midday. The dust motes Hades had returned, a few lazy specks drifting in the sunbeam, and the distant sounds of the street continued their muted rhythmic murmur. The creak of cartwheels and take of cartwheels, and the soft thud ho of hove, blending into a single low note. The taxidermist stood in this stillness, his breathing slow and even, his hands resting on the edge of the bench, his eyes on the bird. He have done this many times, closed the skin over the mannequin and deacon, and watched the creature re-emerge from the hollow shell of its own preserved hide, and yet each time, there was a moment, a brief, quiet pause, when the bird seemed to hover between the state of the staten and the memory and the manufactory of the bin. The moment passed, as it always did, and the taxidermist reached for a clean muslin clothline draped it loosely at the mount, over the mount, protecting it from dust, while the tail set, and the skin adjusted to the toe body. He washed He washed his hands at the basin, the water cool against his fingers hand, and then he stood near the window and looked down at Fulton Street, where the life of the city continued in its usual unhurried way, a reed way. A man walked past with a ladder over his shoulder. A woman carried a basket of laundry. A small boy skipped along the edge of the sidewalk with a hoop and stick. None of them knew what was happening in the narrow shop behind the oak door, and none of them needed to know. The tax door, and none of them needed to know. The taxidermist watched them for a while, his thoughts as calm as the surface of the water in the pewter basin, and then he returned to the bench, and checked the bird one more time, lifting the muslin at the corner to keek at the tail, which was drying flat against the card. Its pits are already became he smoothed shape. He smoothed the breast, one final time, a light, absent touch, and then he covered the bird again and again, and let it rest, let the silk stitches settle into the skin. Let the tow and thread and wire and glass become slowly and quietly, a single and changing thing. The taxidermist left the mounted pigeon resting beneath its muslin cover on the workbench, where the tail feathers were still pinned flat against the card. The silk stitches were settling into the skin. He untied his apron, hung it on the peg by the door, and stepped out through the rear of the shop into the small walled yard, that lay between his building and the back of the Chandler Slandblers. The yard was a narrow rectangle of packed earth open to the pale blue sky, bordered on one side by a brick wall, and on the other by the weathered planks of the shop's own rear wall. A few empty crates were stacked in one corner, and a rain barrel stood under a short length of gutter. Its wooden staves darkened damp, but the taxidermist had come for something else. A pile of wood that lay along the back wall, covered loosely with a sheet of oiled canvas. He lifted the canvas, folding it back in slow sections, and revealed a small store of branches and logs that he had collected over the years. There were pieces of oak, maple, birch and apple, some cut green and dried, others found already seasoned green and dried, others found already seasoned on the forest floor during his occasional walks outside the city. They varied in size from slender twigs no thicker than a pencil, to stout limbs as wide as a man's arm. Their bark still clinging in patches, or worn in patches, or worn away to reveal smooth grey wood beneath. The taxidermist knelt beside the pile and began to sort through it, lifting salt through it, lifting each piece, turning it in his hands, feeling its weight and its balance, examining the way the grain ran, and the small imperfections of knot, of burr that gave each branch its own character. He was looking for a branch that would suit the passenger pigeon, a bird of medium size with long tail feathers and a slender build. The branch needed to be neither too thick nor too thin. Its surface interesting but not distracting. Its wood dense enough to hold the small brass wires he would use to anchor the birds. Its surface interesting but not distracting. Its wood dense enough to hold the small brass wires he would use to anchor the birds' feet. He set aside several pieces that were too knobby or too straight, and then his hand fell on a length of applewood, dark with age, and stained by the elements. Its surface. It muted brown, that deepened to near black in the crevices of the bark. Applewood. He knew was hard and close grained, pleasing to work with, and resistant to splitting, and it carried a faint sweet scent, even years after it had been cut. He lifted the branch and examined it in the daylight, turning it end over end. It was about the thickness of his thumb at its midpoint, tapering gently toward both ends, with a slight curve that suggested the natural growth of a tree rather than the forced straightness of a cultivated limb. A few silvery patches of silvery lichen clung to the bark, and a smaller mobe of a nub former, of a former twig projected from one side, that might catch the light, and give the perch a touch of woodland authenticity. He carried the applewood branch back into the shop, the canvas falling back over the remaining wood, with a soft rustling sigh. The interior of the shop felt cool after the mild warmth of the yard, and his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light as he approached the workbench. He laid the branch on the bench beside the covered bird, and then went to his tool rack, where a small crosscut saw hung from a bi-peg, its teeth fine and sharp, its wooden handle polished by use. He took the saw down, tested its blade with his thumb, and placed it on the bench. Next he selected a length of dowel rod from a bundle that stood in a corner. A straight smooth cylinder of maple, about half an inch in diameter, which he would use to join the branch to its base. The base itself would be a square of dark walnut that he had cut some weeks before, and left on a shelf to acclimate to the shop's humidity. He retrieved the base now, a piece about 5 inches square and 5 inches square and an inch thick. thick, its surface planed flat, its edges beveled, slightly despifled slightly, to soften the corners. The walnut was rich and dark, with a dark, subtle grain, that would not compete with the bird or the branch bird or the branch bird or the branch. He began with the applewood branch, measuring its length against his mental picture of how the mount should look. Sure. Too long a branch would crowd the bird, making the composition unbalanced, while too short a branch would leave the tail feathers hanging in empty air. He settled on a length of about 9 inches, marking the spot with a pencil line that he drew with a small brass rule. Then he set the branch in the wooden vise that was mounted on the end of his workbench, tightening the screw until the branch was held firm, its end protruding. The saw's teeth bit into the applewood with a soft, rhythmic rasp. The sound filling the shop in a slow measured cadence. The cut was straight and clean. The saw following the pencil line, without deviation, and when the waste end fell away and clattered softly onto the floor, the taxidermist picked it up, set it aside, for even small pieces of applewood could be useful for other small amounts. He worked the newly cut end with a small plane, a tool no longer than his hand, its blade set to take off the thinnest possible shaving. The plane whispered over the wood, curling off ribbons of applewood that fell onto the bunch and bench, and smelled faintly of fruit and smoke. He smoothed the cut until the end was flat and even. And then he did the same for the other end of the branch, sawing it to the final length and planing it smooth. The branch now lay on the bench. A piece of wild wood, transformed into a purposeful wild wood perch, its curve rising gently from one end to the other. The lichen still clinging in its small pale patches. The ball, pale patches. The square walnut base required only a small preparation. The taxidermist located its center by drawing two diagonal lines from corner to corner, to the width the pencil and the brass rule, their intersection, marking the exact middle. At this point he used a hand drill, a tool with a cranked handle, and a small sharp bit, a hole to bore a hole halfway through the thickness of the base, the bit turning slowly as he cranked base, the bit turning slowly as he cranked the base, the bit turning slowly as he cranked the base, the bit turning slowly as he cranked the base, the bit turning slowly as he cranked the base, the burst away with a thumb. The hole was sized exactly to receive the maple dowel, which he cut to a short length of about 2 about 2 inches and glued into the hole. The hole with about of warm hide dab of glue from a pot that stood warming plate on a warming plate near the spirit lamp. The spirit lamp. The glue smelled of boiled bone and hide. A faint animal scent that joined the other smells of the shop. He twisted the dowel assel as he pushed it home, spreading the glue evenly around the joint, and then he wiped away the small bead of excess with a damp rag. The base and dowel now became one piece, and he set it aside to let the glue set. While the glue firmed, the taxidermist returned to the applewood branch to drill the holes, the wood that would anchor the bird's feet. He held the branch in his left hand, turning it to find the most natural orientation. The side that would face upward when the base was placed on a shelf. The curve of the branch suggested a particular angle, a gentle slope that would put the bird's body at a slight incline. Its breast tilted toward the viewer, its head at the higher end. Having decided on the orientation, he marked two small dots on the upper surface of the branch. The branch about an inch and a half apart. The spots where the bird's feet would grip the wood. He used a fine awl to start each hole, pressing the sharp point into the applewood with a twisting motion that made a tiny conical depression, just deep enough to guide the drill bit that would follow. The drill he used for this task was even smaller. than the hand drill he had used on the base. A pin vise with a bit no thicker than a sewing needle. He turned the bit by hand, his fingers rotating the nurdle-jawled brass body of the pin vise in a slow, patient motion. The bit sinking into the applewood with a faint gritty sound. The hole deepened, the pinted gritty sound. The by fractions hole deepened, and by fractions, and the taxidermist paused every few turns to withdraw the bit and blow the fine dust from the opening, a light puff of puff that scattered the breath that particles across the bench. When both holes were drilled through the full thickness of the branch, he tested their alignment by threading a spare piece of brass wire through each, the wire passing cleanly and emerging on the underside, where it would later be twisted by tight. The base and dowel had now set enough to work with. The taxidermist applied a small amount of glue to the exposed end of the dowel, and then aligned the branch over it. The underside of the branch drilled in a side of the branch drilled in a corresponding spot to receive the dowel, a shallow hole that he had prepared earlier. With the prepared earlier hand drill, he He pressed the branch down onto the dowel, the two pieces of wood meeting with a snug satisfying fit. And he held it there for a slow count of 60. Feeling the glue begin to grab. The perch now stood upright on the walnut base. Ah, a small tree that had grown from the workbench itself, its applewood rising like a fragment of orchard, brought indoors. The glue would need time to fully cure, but the taxidermist was not yet ready for the bird. The bird. He spent the waiting time in small, quiet tasks, wiping the saw blade with an oily rag, returning the plane to its shelf, sweeping the wood chewing savings and dust from the bench into a small wooden bin that he would later empty into the yard. He also checked He also checked the mounted pigeon beneath its muslin cover, lifting the cloth at one edge to examine the tail feathers. The pins had held the tail in its fanned position through the night, and the feathers were now fully dry and now fully set, their barbs rigid and correctly aligned. He removed the pins one by one, pulling each slender steel shaft from slender steel the card, with the shaft from the card with the pliers, and the tail remained in its shape, a long graduated fan that extended gracefully behind body's body, the birds the bids. The card was set aside, and the tail feathers were set aside, and the tail feathers were now free, ready for the final positioning on the perch. When the glue had set firmly, the taxidermist lifted the assembly and whole perch assembly, and placed it in the center of the workbench, the walnut base, sitting solid and square on the pine planks. He then turned to the mounted pigeon and removed the muslin cover completely, folding it and setting it away. The bird lay on its back on the cork bird board, the leg wires still protruding from the soles of the feet, the body whole and smooth, the eyes staring calmly upward. The taxidermist picked up the bird with both hands, one supporting the breast, the other cradling the back, and he carried it to the perch, he said. He set the bird gently on the branch, aligning the feet over the two drilled holes, the curled toes settling against the applewood, as if the bird had chosen this spot to rest. The leg wires which extended about 2 inches beyond the soles of the feet were now threaded through the holes in the branch. The taxidermist worked from beneath, reaching under the branch with the forceps to grasp the tip of each wire and pull it downward, drawing the feet drawing the feet firmly against the wood. The wire passed through the metatarsal pads, those small tough cushions on the soles of the feet, and as he pulled, the claws curled naturally around the curve of the branch, the three hose gripping toes gripping one side, the single rear toe hooking around the other, the other. He adjusted, the tension slowly, pulling a little, then relaxing, then pulling again, until the feet rested on the wood, with the secure grip of a living bird that had just alighted. The wires were then bent flat against the underside of the branch, twisted together in a tight knot, and trimmed with the snips, the sharp ends, filed smooth, so they would not snag on anything. The taxidermist straightened up and looked at the bird on its perch. The mount was now physically attached, but the pose was not yet final. The body sat a little too upright. The neck a fraction too straight. The head turned at an angle that felt slightly stiff, slightly too symmetrical. He reached out and placed the tip of his forefinger against the bird's breast, applying the lightest pressure, barely enough to disturb a feather. The body settled forward by just a degree. The center of gravity shifting, the curve of the back becoming a touch more relaxed, the posture of more relaxed, the bird posture of a bird that had paused in its examination of a nearby twig, and might at nearby tinmo its continue its quiet survey. He then placed two fingers on the side of the bird, the feather-like touch. And touch turned it a few points further to the right, so that the beak was angled toward a small knot in the applewood branch, a dark round eye that might have been a winter bud or a dormant insect hidden among the hidden patches of libiculations. The everyday iridescence in throat caught the light with this adjustment, the purple and green flashing once, before settling into a steady, deep shimmer. The tail still fanned from its time on the card, swept downward in a long graceful curve that just cleared the surface of the walnut base, its longest, its feathers nearly brushing the dark wood. The taxidermist removed his hands and let the bird be. He stood back, straightening his apron, with a habitual tug at the strings, and he let the silence of the finished mount fill the room. The passenger pigeon was now complete. It sat on its applewood branch, its applewood claws gripping the lichen knotted bark. Its head turned toward a small imperspection infection in the wood, as if it had noticed something and paused to consider it. The pinkish breast glowed with with a soft internal warmth. Soft internal warmth. The glass eyes held the lamplight in their brown and yellow depths. Yellow depths. And the whole creature gave off an air of quiet, arrested motion. The stillness of a bird that had been caught in a moment of repose and moment of pause held that drag earth get that dran the taxidermist did. The taxidermist did not move for a long while. He stood near the bench, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and even, his eyes resting on the bird. The shop around him was quiet. The only sounds, the faint hiss of the spirit lamp and the distant muffled noises of Fulton Street, which seemed to belong to another world entirely. The light from the high window had shifted into the soft amber of late afternoon, and it fell across the perch in a warm column that made the applewood blow, and caught the edges of the bird's feathers in a thin line of gold. The dust motes which had been still for much of the day began to drift again, stirred by some small current of some small air from the vent, and they danced around the mounted bird like a slow, silent benediction. After the taxidermist reached for a small glass dome that stood on a shelf near the back of the shop, one of several. He kept for clients who wanted their mounts protected from dust. The dome was bell-shaped with a turned wooden knob at the top. Its glass clear and without bubbles. He lifted it carefully, holding it by the base, and lowered it over the bird and its perch, the rim settling onto the square walnut base with a soft final click. The dome enclosed the passenger pigeon in a small transparent world of its own, separated from the dust and the drafts and the passing of time and the end. And the bird looked out through the glass, with its calm, unchanging gaze. The taxidermist wiped his hands on his apron, walked to the front of the shop, and opened the door just enough to look out at the street, the street. The afternoon was waning, the shadows lengthening across the cobblestones and the airstones, and the air carried the cool damp smell of approaching evening. He stood there for a minute, watching the city wind down, and then he closed the door, slid the bolt, and returned to the bench. He looked at the finished mount one more time. A quiet satisfaction settling over him. Not a feeling of pride or accomplishment, but simply the calm that follows a task done well and follows a task done without hurry, well and Then without hurry, then he turned down the lamp, the flame shrinking to a small appalled blue bood. And the shop dimmed, the shop dimmed, the shop dimmed, the glass dome catching the last of the light and holding it, like it, a tiny captive star. 3 days. 3 days passed before the gentleman returned. Then eat eines Königkapedischen. The Batzebesegen Craftsman, the Shithmith School Mount for a schoolmaster in Brooklyn, the preparation Brooklyn, the preparation of a dozen study skins of warblers, forers, for a natural, a hatchel, a street society history, society in Boston, the shaft, the battery at Wheatball, let baftis there, trouble the away. The passenger pigeon remained on the workbench, covered by the glass dome, its walnut base sitting squarely pine planks, its applewood branch, curving wood branch, upward into the still air, the bird itself as the motionless as the day it had been completed. The tax completed, the taxidermist passed it many times each day, and each time he glanced at time. He glanced at it, not out of pride, but out of the quiet habit of checking on things that had been entrusted to his care. On the morning of the third day, a Thursday, the light through the high window was soft and diffuse, filtered by a thin layer of cloud, the cloud that had moved in from the harbor overnight. The air in the shop felt heavier than usual, carrying a hint of moisture, and the taxidermist had lit the small iron stove and the iron stove in the corner to keep the damp from settling into the specimens. He was at the bench, settling into the specimens. He was at the bench, reattaching a loose wing feather on the fox with a dab of fish glue, when he heard the sound of a carriage drawing up outside. And outside, in the familiar light tread of footsteps approaching the door. The knock came. Three soft taps with the head of a walking stick. And the taxidermist set down his brush, wiped his fingers on the rag, and went to the door. He opened it to find the same tall gentleman, Mr. Reginald Ashbinald, standing on the doorstep with his beaver hat in one hand and a leather satchel slung over the opposite shoulder. The gentleman was dressed much as he had been on his first visit, in a dark wool coat with a velvet collar. Though today he also wore a scarf of a deep burgundy color, loosely knotted at his throat. He looked well rested and calm, and his expression carried the quiet anticipation of a collector who was about to receive something he had been waiting for. The taxidermist stepped aside and welcomed him in with a simple nod, and the gentleman entered the shop, the door closing behind him with its familiar soft thud. The smell of the room, the camphor, and four and feeder, and the faint mineral cedar, and the faint mineral bite of the arsenical soapical soap seemed to settle around him like a cloak. And he breathed it in as though the scent itself were part of the experience he had come for. He set his hat on the counter, and turned toward the workbench, where the glass dome caught the glass. Caught the grey light from the window and gleamed with a faint pearly luster. The taxidermist led him to the bench, and together they stood before the mounted pigeon. The gentleman leaned forward, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes traveling over the eyes, traveling over the attention bird with an attention that was both keen and unhurried. He examined the posture first, the slight forward posture first, the tilt of slight forward, the body tilt of the body, the angle of the head, the way the long tail feathers swept down in a graceful arc that nearly touched the walnut base. He noted the iridescence of the throat, the purple and green and bronze that shimmered even in the muted light of the overcast morning. He looked at the glass eyes, which gazed with their calm, unchanging expression, toward the knot in the applewood branch, and he made a small sound, a quiet hum of approval that was barely more than an exhalation. The helation. The taxidermist lifted the glass dome, setting it aside on the bench with a careful two-handed motion. Its weight shifting and settling with a soft clink against the pine. The gentleman leaned closer, inspecting the seam along the breast. But the stitches were invisible under the plumage, and he could see nothing but the smooth, unbroken sweep of feathers, from throat to vent. He asked if he might touch, and the taxidermist nodded. So the nodded gentleman extended one finger and ran it very lightly along the curve of the wing, feeling the firmness of the toe beneath, the cool, slightly stiff texture of the preserve the kin wing, the way the feathers lay flat and true with Tacky's rough patches. He withdrew his finger and nodded, and there was in that nod a quiet satisfaction that needed no words. He straightened up and reached into the inner pocket of his coat, producing a small leather purse that was closed with a drawstring of braided silk cord. The purse was worn at the edges. The leather darkened by handling, and it made a soft, heavy sound as he set it on. He set it on the counter, the sound of silver coins shifting against one another. He loosened the drawstring and counted out the remaining balance of the agreed price. Stacking the coins in a neat column on the wooden counter, three silver pieces each one about the size of a modern and nodder $half, but thicker, with milled edges and a design that had been softened, that had by years of circulation, circulation. The coins gleamed in the grey light, their surfaces catching a faint, cool gleam. The taxidermist picked them up one by one, tested their weight briefly in his palm, and then dropped them into the drawer beneath the counter, where they clinked against the deposit the gentleman that had left on his first visit. The transaction was complete. The side. The gentleman then turned his attention to the practical matter of transporting the mount. He had brought his leather satchel, which he now opened on the counter, unfolding the top flap to reveal a deep padded interior, lined with raw wool fleece, the fibers soft and creamy and white, still carrying a faint animal analinol. The interior faint analinol. The interior of the satchel was spacious enough to hold the walnut base, and the glass dome, and the fleece padding would protect the bird from the jostling of the carriage, the carriage ride. The taxidermist replaced the glassist replaced the glass dome over the mount, seating it carefully on the base, and then he picked up the entire assembly, cradling it in both hands, as though it weighed more than it did. He lowered it into the satchel nest, nestling it into the fleece, adjusting the padding around the sides and top until the dome was held. The dome was held snug and immobile. The gentleman watched this process without comment. His hands resting on the counter. And when the satchel washel was closed, and the strap buckled, he lifted it, and settled it over his shoulder, with an ease that suggested he was accustomed to carrying objects of value through the city streets. Before leaving, the gentleman asked in his quiet, measured way, whether the taxidermist might be willing to accompany him to his home and assist in placing the mountain in its final position within its cabinet, the cabinet. The taxidermist who had no pressing work that afternoon, and whose curiosity about the cabinet had been quietly growing since the gentleman had first mentioned it. It agreed with a simple inclination of his head. He untied his apron, hung it on its peg, put on a plain wool coat that had seen many seasons, and lifted his own hat from a hook near the door. The two men stepped out into the street, the taxidermist locking the oak door behind him with a large iron key that he carried on, ring at his belt. A hired carriage stood waiting at the curb. The curb, its driver perched on a high seat, his coat collar turned up against the damp air, the horse a steady, patient bay with a long mane, that hung long mane, that hung entangled strands, the gentleman's strands. The gentleman and the taxidermist climbed into the carriage. The satchel placed carefully on the gentleman's lap, and the driver flicked the reins, the horse starting forward, with a horse starting forward, with a slow rhythmic clop of iron shoes on cobblestone. The carriage rocked gently on its springs, its wheels turning with a steady grinding crunch, and the two men sat in comfortable silence, watching the city pass by through the square window. The route northward took them northward through the streets of Lower Manhattan, past rows of brick buildings with shop fronts at street level, and curtained windows above, past churches with tall white steeples, and public houses with painted signs swinging on iron brackets. Past the brackets, past the open square of the park, will the bath. Parts. The sky remained overcast, a uniform pale grey, that seemed to press down on the rooftops, softening every outline, muting every colour, and the light that filtered through the carriage window was thin and silvery, very like light seen through a layer of water. The taxidermist watched the city move by, the people, the carts, the wandering dogs, the children running along the sidewalks, all of it, a slow, silent pageant that required no comment, and invited none. After perhaps half an hour, the carriage turned onto a wider, quieter street, lined with elm trees, their bare branches interlacing overhead, in a dark network against the grey sky. The houses here were larger, set back from the street, behind low iron fences, their facades of warm brownstone or painted brick, their windows tall, their many paned, their front doors painted in deep sober colours, and set with polished brass knockers. This sets palaced with polished brass with rana. The street was nearly empty of traffic, and the sound of the horses' hooves echoed softly off the house fronts, a steady, unhurried beat that matched the taxidermist's own breathing. The carriage drew up before one of these townhouses, a 3-story building of red brick with white stone trim. Its townhouses, a 3-story building of red brick with white stone trim. Its door painted a deep forest green, and set with a fanlight of lead of glass above. The gentleman opened the carriage door and stepped down. The taxidermist following, and the driver. The driver tipped his hat and weighted. The horse stamping one foot, and settling back into its patient stillness. The gentleman produced a key from his pocket, and unlocked his pocket, and unlocked the front door, pushing it open onto a wide, dim hallway with a tiled floor, and a staircase that rose at the far end. Its banister of dark polished wood curving upward into shadow. The two men entered, the door closing behind them with a deep solid sound that shut out the street entirely. Through the hallway smelled of beeswax and old paper, of dried lavender, and something faintly spicy, perhaps the residue of pipe tobacco from a study deeper in the house. The gentleman led the way up the staircase. The taxidermist following a few steps behind. The leather satchel still cradled securely in the gentleman's arms. The stairs creaked under their weight with soft musical notes. Each step a slightly different pitch from the one before, and the light from a tall window on the landing fell in a column of dusty gold across the upper hallway. The gentleman stopped before a door on the second floor, a wide door of dark mahogany, with panels of figured grain, and opened it with a small brass key, that he took from a pocket in his waistcoat. The door swung inward, and the gentleman stepped through. Then turned and gestured for the taxidermist Torthu. Follow the tax. The taxidermist entered the room and paused just inside the threshold. His eyes adjusting to the light, and then widening slightly as he took in the sight before him. The room was a cabinet of curiosities. A private museum assembled over what must have been many years of patient collecting. It occupied the entire front half of the second floor, with two tall windows facing the street. There panes of old, slightly wavy glass, letting in a soft diffused light, the diffused light that gave everything in the room a gentle underwater quality. Everything in the room a gentle underwater quality. The floor was covered with a thick carpet in a pattern of faded crimson and gold. And the gold in the walls were lined with shelves and cases of polished mahogany. Their surfaces gleaming with a deep reddish brown luster that came only from age and careful wax skinning. On these shelves and in these cases rested the gentleman's collection. A quiet assembly of objects that spanned the natural world and the arts of measurement of observation. There were mineral specimens, crystals of quartz and amethyst, and citius and citrine. Their facets catching the grey light and throwing tiny prismatic sparks. There were seashells, conches, anches, and cowries and spiraling wheel skulks. Some polished to a high gloss, others left in their natural chalky choke state, their chambers empty and silent, an silent. An astrolabe labe of brass stood on a small table, near one window, its nested rings tilted at an angle, its surface engraved with tiny precise markings that spoke of stows and stars and navigation and the slow turning of the heavens. A pinned atlas moth was mounted in a shallow frame, its wings of russet and net and cream spanning nearly the width of a man's hand, its feathered antennae spread like two delicate ferns. Several small songbirds rested under glass domes on a lower shelf, a goldfinch anch and a bluebird antbird and a tiny brown wren, each one perched on its own small branch, their glass eyes shining in the dim light, like drops of dark honey dark. The time. The glass eyes shining in the dim light, like drop. The room had a smell of its own, distinct from the rest of the house, a blend of old wood and leather, of dust and minerals, and the faint dry scent of preserved specimens with an undernote under something of peace, from a puriper bowl that sat on the mantelpiece. Feel peace. The air was still and slightly cool, and the only sound was the gentle tick of a long case clock, that stood in one corner, its pendulum swinging with a slow measured beat that seemed to count the seconds of the entire house. The gentleman pre-tied by our supplied of blide or to find a moat, not to the pole or buried. At fruity outside, Steindel dekiled at the bubble cards and rubber butts and the mobile birds, its aid in the barbaric and the thigh can at sepulchre they tie cat of its shelf. The taxidermist stepped forward and helped guide the base into its appointed spot, making tiny adjustments until the walnut square sat centered and true. The bird facing outward at the exact angle they had agreed during that first conversation in the shop. When the mount was in place, the taxidermist and the gentleman stood back together, side by side, and regarded the passenger pigeon in its new home. The rose quartz on one side glowed with a soft pinkish light. That light that seemed to echo the pink of the bird's breast, Anne's breast, and the green leather of the Audubon folio on the other side picked up the green tones in the iridescent throat, creating a harmony of color that was entirely accidental and had feedy breaded cats. The carefully planned. The bird sat on its applewood branch amid these neighbors, and the afternoon light fell across it in a column of dust that moved as slowly as the minute hand of the long case clock. A beam of silver gray that touched the glass dome and made it gleam like a small captive moon. Like a small captive moon, the captive moon. The gentleman remained silent for a long while his hands clasped behind his back, back, his gaze resting on the mounted pigeon. Then he turned to the taxidermist, gave a small, formal bow of his head, that conveyed more gratitude than any words he might have spoken, and extended his hand. The taxidermist shook it, feeling the cool dry palm, and the light firm pressure, and then the gentleman asked if he might offer some refreshment, a cup of tea or a glass of sherry, as was the custom of hospitality. The taxidermist, who was not thirsty but who understood the quiet ritual of such things, accepted a small glass of sherry, which the gentleman poured from a decanter that stood on a side table, the amber liquid catching the light, its scent nutty and warm. They stood together in the cabinet room, sipping their sherry in the soft afternoon quiet, the clock ticking its slow rhythm, the atlas moth, dreaming on the wall, the seashells holding their ancient silence, the rose quartz glowing with its gentle light, internal light. The silence, the rose quartz glowing with its gentle, the passenger pigeon, the newest resident of this small private museum, gathered the afternoon around itself like a cloak, and the dust motes danced in the beam of light that fell across the glass dome, and no one said anything more. Because there was nothing more that needed to be said. The mount was complete. The cabinet was richer by one quiet bird and the world outside. The tall windows had softened into the grey, muted colors of late afternoon. Waiting patiently for evening to descend long after the taxidermist had returned to his shop on Fulton Street, and the gentleman had closed the door of his cabinet for the mounted passenger pigeon remained on its shelf, the glass dome holding it apart from the small drift of dust that settled on everything else in the room. The years that followed were kind to the bird in the way that stillness is kind to fragile things. The taxidermist continued his work, filling his ledger with new commissions, and in time, his own hands grew slower. His eyes less sharp, until one winter he closed the shop for the last. The time, the oak door bolted, and the high window dark window. His name recorded in that mob legible ledger became just one more entry among many, a few lines of sloping script that recorded a gentleman's addresses and a species name, and a sum paid in silver coin, the ink fading slowly toward the color of rust. The passenger pigeon in the cabinet room knew nothing of this. It stood on its applewood branch year after year, the curve of its neck holding the same gentle turn, the glass eyes fixed on the same small knot in the lichen dotted wood, the pinkish breastish breast, glowing with the same soft internal warmth that the taxidermist had preserved so carefully on that distant morning. The gentleman, Mr. Reginald Ashby. Reginald Ashby grew older older as well. His hair turning from grey to white. His steps slowing on the staircase. But he still visited the cabinet room whenever his days allowed, and each time he paused before the mounted pigeon, and seemed to draw from its stillness some small portion of the calm that had the world outside, the tall windows changed in ways that the quiet room did not. The city spread northward, its streets lengthening, its buildings rising taller, the sound of hooves on cobblestone, giving way to stone, giving way to the rattle of iron wheels, and the distant hum of industry. The elm trees on the quiet street grew, and of industry. The elm trees on the quiet street grew and died, and were replaced by saplings that knew nothing, of the carriages that had once passed beneath their predecessors, and in the forests beyond the city, the passenger pigeons were vanishing. The great flocks that had once darkened the sky for hours, the derivers of birds that had poured across the eastern woodlands inlands in numbers beyond counting, were thinning, fragmenting, dissolving into the vast silence of loss. A few remained, then fewer, then a single, then fewer, then bird in a single bird in a cage in a city far away, and then none at all. The species that had numbered in the then none at all. The species that had numbered in the billions passed from the world as quietly as a shadow crossing a patch of sun, and the mounted bird in the cabinet room became something its maker had never intended, a relic of a world that no longer existed. The bird Corsum was unaware of this. It continued to perch on its applewood branch, its wings folded, its tail sweeping downward, its glass eyes reflecting the slow seasonal light that fell through the wavy window panes. Spring light brought a soft, greenish cast that seemed to pick out the iridescent green in the throat feathers, while autumn light, low and golden, deepened and groans the bronze and made the breast glow with a warmth that was almost living. Winter light was pale and thin. A silvery wash that turned the glass dome into a mirror, and made the glass dome into a mirror, and made the bird appear to float too, in a small luminous cloud. The seasons passed one after the other, an endless gentle cycle, and the bird remained at the center of them, motionless, patient, holding its quiet pose for the room, the cabinet itself outlasted its creator, as such collections often do. The gentleman's heirs, people of a different generation with different interests, kept the room closed for many years, for many, the mahogany shells, gathering a mahogany shells, gathering a fine shells, gathering a fine layer of dust, the atlas moth, slowly fading on its pin, the astrolabe tilting at its silent angle, the long case clock ran down and stopped, its pendulum hanging still, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old house settling on its foundations, its sound as soft and regular as a sleeper's breath. The passenger pigeon, under its glass dome, waited through all of this, neither knowing nor caring that the world beyond the door had forgotten. It had forgotten it. The dust that settled on the dome was the same dust settled everywhere, composed of fragments of wool, carpet and linen curtain, and the linen curtain, and the faint dry decay of old paper. And it gave the glass a soft, cloudy bloom that softened the bird that has outline, until it seemed almost to be a brie both, and that the deaf fang would it for the tiny trend and December's finadingly fast sank the kank that it didn't burst one day, long after the last of the gentleman's line had left the house. A new owner opened the cabinet door and stood in the threshold, blinking in the stale, motionless, airless air. The room was exactly as it was, exactly as it had been left, decades left, before the shelves still holding, their quiet assembly of shells and stones and birds, the stones and birds, the clock still silent, the carpet still faded silent, in its crimson and gold pattern, the new owner, a person of patient and curious disposition, spent many days carefully cataloguing the collection, lifting each object from its shelf, turning its shelf object from its shelf, turning it over with careful hands, noting its condition in a smaller book. When they came to the passenger, the pigeon, they lifted the glass dome and held the mount to the light, examining the fine stitches, hidden stitches, hidden beneath the breast feathers, the neat wrapping of thread on the leg bones, the alignment of the glass eyes. They recognized the work of a skilled hand, though the taxidermist's name had long since been lost to time, the marbled legible ledger having been sold or discarded or simply crumbled away in some forgotten drawer. The bird was cleaned gently, the dome wiped free of dust, the walnut base polished with a soft cloth, until the dark crows gleamed again, grain gleamed again. It was placed back on its shelf, in the same spot between the rose quartz and the audubon folio, and the room was left open now and then to air, the windows lifted on mild afternoon so the slow current of fresh air could move through the space. The sun continued to fall across the shelf in its slow daily arc, and the passenger pigeon continued. To rest there, its glass, its eyes holding the light, its feathers unruffled, by the small breezes that stirred the dust on the sill. The years that followed, were centuries. Centuries, and they passed, as all centuries pass. Pass in a quiet, unceasing accumulation of moments. Ceasing accumulation of moments that no single mind could hold. That could hold the city around the cabinet room changed beyond recognition. The brick townhouse eventually replaced by a larger building, the cabinet itself dispersed to new owners, some of whom valued the objects it contained, and some of whom did not. The passenger not. The passenger pigeon passed from hand to hand, from shelf to shelf, from one glass dome to another, and through all of these journeys it remained intact. The arsenical soap, and the alum and the careful had hemp thread, doing their silent work through the decades. The bird was sold at auctions, inherited by distant relatives, donated to small distant relatives, donated to small museums, stored in attics and basements, and once in the back room of a shop where the owner used it as a quiet companion while she read through the long afternoon. And alms, and all the while the memory of the living passenger pigeon faded from the human world. The vast flocks passed into the realm of stories, then into the realm of legend, and finally into the dry pages of history books where they became a paragraph, a footnote, a cautionary tale about the limits of abundance. The mounted bird knew nothing of this abundance. The mounted bird knew nothing of this. It had never known the sky, only the light that fell on it from windows, and lamps, and the occasional flicker of a candle. It had never known the sound of wind through feathers, only the silence of glass domes and zanes, and the creak of old woodacre of old wood. It had never known the company of its own kind, only the still faces of other mounts, that shared its shelves, a blue jay, a gold finch, a small brown wren, each one equally silent, equally separate from the living world, yet equally separate from the was something in the bird's posture, something that the taxidermist had captured in that long ago morning on Fulton Street, that spoke across the years, the slight forward tilt of the body, the quiet turn of the head, the way the claws grip the applewood branch, the apple as if at any moment they might release and launch, and the bird into flight. All of it held the memory of motion, the echo of life, all of it at the coast of a bird that had flown through forests where the passing chance headaches and tremble. None of this was visible to the casual eye, but it was there, held in the toe and wire and glass, a small, quiet monument to something that had been and was no more. The story ends, as all stories do, not with a conclusion, but with a continuation. The passenger pigeon still, The passenger pigeon still exists, somewhere, on a shelf in a museum. A museum storage room or a private collection or storage room or a private collection, or the dim corner of a university archive, The glass dome that covers it, that covers it may be original, or it may be a replacement, fitted by some later pair of hands, and the walnut base may bear the pair of hands, and the walnut base may bear the scratches and rings of many moves, many dustings, many years. The apple broachwood branch has long since lost the scent of the orchard. The orchard, but its lichen still clings in pale papery patches, and the small knot toward which the bird turns its head is still there, unchanged. A tiny eye of darker wood, Trantext Nystendams chosest, because it reminded him of a Buim, it's a play Euxenic inspect. The room where the bird now rests is quiet, as all such rooms are quiet. A clock ticks somewhere in the building. A slow, steady rhythm that measures out the seconds without hurry, without pause. The light that enters the room comes through a window with modern glass clear and flat, and it falls across the glass dome in a clean sharp beam that makes the dust motes glitter as they drift. The bird does not see this light, because its eyes are glass and cannot see, but it holds the light nonetheless, the way lost still. Water holds water, hallotes the reflection of the sky. And if you were to lean close to the dome, close close enough that your breath would fog the glass. If you breathe too hard, you might see the tiny invisible stitches along the breast, the faint sheen of cedar oil. On of the breast, the brain, the cedar oil. On of the breast, the brain edge, trailing length. Ja, det sökte the giz, Ordings scab was stunted the Okaimanda carried into their work. The calm that survives in the mounted bird like a faint a dinstoral, a dorals, a de shelf and the moth nerve de nof. Stels bikes to cells at the stels but science and south senstenances and odent.